You've seen the movies, you know the scenes. Tony Montana, white powder on his desk, firing into the darkness. Say hello to my little friend. George Young, standing in the sunlight of a Colombian cocaine lab, watching Pablo Escobar weigh bricks. Denzel Washington in a fur coat, walking through Harlem like he owned every block. These are some of the most iconic moments in cinema history. Scarface, Blow, American Gangster, Narcos, Black Mass, American Made. But Hollywood took the real stories of the most dangerous drug lords in modern history, and they cleaned them up, made them cinematic, made them watchable. And in doing so, they buried some of the parts that would have made you question humanity and even your own government. Tonight, we're going behind the scenes, behind the casting choices, behind the carefully edited trailers. These are the real drug lords behind the most famous movies and TV shows ever made. By the end, how you watch these films will change forever. Welcome, Midnight Magnates. This is Mr. Calder. As the world goes quiet, we step into the shadows to uncover the stories that built our world. If you enjoy listening or falling asleep to the hidden history of power, fortunes made, and the human nature behind the price of greatness, then this is the place for you. Before we begin, I'll ask you something. Which was your favorite drug lord movie or show? My favorite was the one that introduced me to the world of drug empires and criminal legends, Scarface. I saw it in a hotel room in 1984, and I remember thinking, surely no one actually lives like this. No one is this reckless, this violent, this consumed by power. I was wrong. The real people behind these films were worse. Let me know yours in the comments. Now, let me take you on a journey through history. February 19th, 1986, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. A white Cadillac sits in the parking lot of a Salvation Army halfway house. Behind the wheel is a man named Barry Seal. He's 46 years old, overweight, balding. He doesn't look like a character Tom Cruise would play in a movie. But Barry Seal has lived a life that would take 3 movies to tell. He was a TWA pilot, one of the youngest in the airline's history. Then he became the most prolific drug smuggler in the Medellin cartel's network, moving 1,500 kilos of cocaine per flight at $500,000 a run. Then he became the DEA's most valuable informant. The CIA installed cameras on his plane. He photographed Pablo Escobar loading cocaine. Those photos were used by the Reagan White House to justify funding the Contra War in Nicaragua. And then the White House leaked his name to the press. Think about that for a moment. The same government that recruited him, that put cameras on his plane, that used his evidence to shape foreign policy. That government published his identity to score political points. Now he's sitting in a Cadillac in a parking lot, a sitting duck, because the terms of his sentencing require him to sleep at this halfway house every night. A fixed, known location. The Medellin cartel has put a bounty on his head. $1 million if he's captured alive. $500,000 if he's dead. 3 Colombian men step out of a vehicle across the lot. They're carrying MAC-10 submachine guns. What happened to Barry Seal is one of the most disturbing stories in American intelligence history. But that is not where this story begins. If these stories speak to you, If you find comfort in the lessons found in the quiet corners of history, tap the follow button to join our circle of dreamers and let the next story find you when you need it most. South Boston in the 1950s was a place that made you pick a side early. You either worked the docks, joined the service, or found a third option that nobody talked about at Sunday dinner. James Joseph Bulger Jr. picked the third option before he was old enough to vote. They called him Whitey. He hated the name. Blonde hair, pale blue eyes, a temper that could fill a room before he even opened his mouth. By 17, he'd racked up charges for assault, armed robbery, and enough general mayhem that the courts ran out of patience. By 26, he was sitting in a federal cell at Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, staring at a sentence long enough to rearrange a man's priorities. Now, here's where the story takes its first turn. And it's a turn that most people, even people who think they know the Bulger story, have never heard. In 1957, a doctor approached Bulger's cell with an offer: participate in a medical research program. The pitch was simple. They were studying treatments for schizophrenia, new pharmaceutical interventions, cutting-edge science. Bulger would receive reduced time on his sentence, maybe better conditions. All he had to do was take some pills and report how he felt. What they didn't tell him was that the program wasn't run by doctors. It was run by the Central Intelligence Agency, Project MK Ultra, the most ambitious and most illegal mind control program in American history. For over a year, Bulger was given LSD, not once, not as part of some careful, measured clinical trial, repeatedly, in escalating doses, sometimes combined with other substances. The goal wasn't to cure schizophrenia. The goal was to see if lysergic acid diethylamide could be used to break a human mind open like a lockbox and rearrange what was inside. Bulger later described the sessions. He talked about hallucinations so vivid he couldn't separate them from reality for days. He described a period where he believed he could read other people's thoughts. He talked about rage, a kind of rage that didn't have a source, didn't have a target, just filled him like water filling a basement. He said the nightmares lasted decades. And here's what matters. The United States government identified a violent young criminal, told him they were going to help him, pumped him full of psychedelics for 14 months, studied what happened to his brain, wrote it all down in classified files, and then put him back on the street. No follow-up, no monitoring, no accountability. Meanwhile, back in South Boston, something remarkable was happening in the Bulger household. Whitey's younger brother, William, Billy Bulger, same neighborhood, same parents, same kitchen table. Billy went to Boston College, then Boston College Law School. He entered politics and climbed. State representative, state senator, and eventually president of the Massachusetts State Senate, one of the most powerful political figures in the state's history. A man who controlled committee assignments, influenced judicial appointments, and shaped legislation for 2 decades. So picture this. One brother running the state legislature, the other brother running the streets. And both of them operating in the same city, sometimes in the same rooms, always with the same last name. The proximity wasn't accidental, it was useful to both of them. By the early 1970s, Whitey Bulger had worked his way into the Winter Hill Gang, the dominant Irish-American organized crime operation in the Boston area. He wasn't the founder. That was Howie Winter. But Bulger had something Winter didn't. He had patience. He had a political brother whose name opened doors that muscle couldn't. And he had a particular kind of intelligence that the LSD experiments may have sharpened or may have simply failed to destroy. The Winter Hill Gang controlled loan sharking, truck hijacking, race fixing, and enough of South Boston's economy that legitimate business owners paid tribute without being asked twice. Bulger rose through the ranks the way anyone rises through the ranks of a criminal organization. He was reliable when reliability mattered. He was violent when violence was required. And he was smart enough to know which one a given Tuesday called for. By the mid-1970s, Bulger was effectively co-running the operation alongside Stephen Flemmi, a man whose own story could fill a story. Flemmi was already something interesting. He was already a government informant. Had been for years. Which means that when Bulger stepped into the leadership of the Winter Hill Gang, he stepped into an organization that was already compromised. The CIA had experimented on him. Now the FBI was circling, and James Whitey Bulger, the kid from the Old Harbor Housing Project, the guinea pig from Atlanta Federal Penitentiary, was about to become the most protected criminal in American history. The question isn't whether the system failed. The question is whether it was working exactly as designed. The man who changed everything was named John Connolly, and the most important thing about John Connolly isn't that he was an FBI agent, it's that he was from Southie, born and raised, same neighborhood as the Bulgers, same streets, same parish, same code. There's a story, probably true, probably embellished in the way all origin stories get embellished, that a teenage Whitey Bulger once bought young Johnny Connolly an ice cream cone. A small kindness from a local tough to a neighborhood kid. The kind of gesture that means nothing in most places, but means everything in South Boston, where loyalty is the only currency that never inflates. Connolly joined the FBI in 1968. He was assigned to the Boston field office, and by the mid-1970s, he had a problem that was also an opportunity. See, the FBI's number one priority in Boston wasn't the Irish mob. It was the Italian mob. The Patriarcha crime family, run out of Providence, Rhode Island, with deep roots in Boston's North End. Taking down the Patriarcha family would be a career maker. The kind of case that got you promoted, got you commendations, got your name in the newspapers. But the FBI needed intelligence. They needed someone inside, or at least adjacent, who could tell them what the Italians were planning. Connolly's pitch to Bulger was elegant in its simplicity. You give us information on the Patriarcha family. In return, we leave you alone. More than that, we protect you. Now, on paper, this is a standard informant arrangement. The FBI uses them constantly, always has. You cultivate sources in criminal organizations, you trade small fish for big fish, and everybody moves up the food chain. The Bureau's informant program had rules, oversight, documentation requirements. It was, in theory, carefully managed. In practice, in Boston, in the late 1970s, it was a circus with no ringmaster. Bulger agreed to the deal. On paper, he became a top echelon informant, the FBI's most valuable category. His handler was John Connolly. His file grew thick with reports. Intelligence on mafia operations, names, dates, locations. Connolly's supervisors were pleased. Connolly himself was thriving. He dressed well. He dined at the best restaurants. He had access to information that made him indispensable. But here's the twist that turns this story from a corruption case into something much darker. Bulger wasn't really giving the FBI valuable intelligence. Not in the way the arrangement was supposed to work. Much of what he provided was either information the FBI already had, or information about mafia activities that were already winding down, or information that was just vague enough to sound useful without actually being useful. What was actually happening was the reverse. The FBI was giving Bulger intelligence. Connolly told Bulger about active investigations. He warned him about wiretaps. He told him which of his associates were cooperating with law enforcement. He told him about grand jury proceedings. He told him when indictments were coming. The informant was running his handler, not the other way around. And Connolly wasn't alone. His supervisor, John Morris, was also on the take. Over 2 decades, Connolly and Morris accepted approximately $235,000 in cash from Bulger and Flemmy. Gifts, dinners, a case of wine here, an envelope there. Morris once accepted $7,000 in cash, and then, in a moment of what can only be described as guilty panic, donated some of it to his church. As if that balanced the ledger. Half the FBI's Boston office wanted to cut Bulger loose. They saw the arrangement for what it was, a liability, an embarrassment waiting to happen. The other half needed the metrics his intelligence provided. Every report Connolly filed justified the program. Every name Bulger dropped, useful or not, became a data point that proved the top echelon informant program was working. Both sides had their reasons. Only one side had blood on its hands. Well, that's not quite right either. Both sides had blood on their hands. One side just didn't know it yet. The FBI's institutional culture in this era was driven by numbers. How many informants do you have? How many cases have they contributed to? What's your conviction rate? It was a metrics machine, and Bulger was a metric that kept producing. Nobody wanted to turn off the machine. Nobody wanted to be the person who closed the file on the Bureau's most productive informant in the Northeast. So the warnings went unheeded. The internal complaints were filed and forgotten. And John Connolly continued to meet Whitey Bulger at dinners, in parked cars, in back rooms of South Boston restaurants, passing information back and forth like 2 men sharing a newspaper on a train. Except the newspaper was a list of people who were about to die. When John Connolly passed information to Bulger about suspected informants, about people who were talking to law enforcement, about associates who might be cooperating with investigations, Bulger acted on that information, quickly, quietly, and with a consistency that should have alarmed everyone. The pattern was almost always the same. The target would receive an invitation, a meeting, a sit-down to discuss business, something routine, something that wouldn't raise suspicion. They'd arrive at the house, and they wouldn't leave. Bulger and Flemmy would restrain them, chain them to chairs in some cases. The interrogation would begin. Not to gather intelligence, understand? Bulger already had the intelligence. Connolly had given it to him. The interrogation was theater. It was Bulger confirming what he already knew, watching the person in the chair realize, slowly, and then all at once, that there was no version of this conversation that ended with them walking out. Then a gunshot, usually to the back of the head, and then the basement. Bodies were buried beneath the floor, packed into the earth, covered over. The house continued to look unremarkable from the outside. Curtains still drawn, 3 steps up to the front door. Bulger was eventually convicted of participating in 11 murders. 11 that could be proven in court. The real number? Well, nobody knows the real number. Estimates range higher, some significantly higher. And every one of those murders happened while Bulger was an active FBI informant. While John Connolly was filing reports about what a valuable asset Bulger was, while supervisors were approving those reports, while the metrics kept climbing. Think about that for a moment. A man walks into an FBI field office. He files paperwork establishing an individual as a protected government informant. That individual goes home and murders someone. The FBI agent files another report. Another person disappears. Another report. The cycle repeats for years, for over a decade, and the system doesn't catch it, doesn't stop it, doesn't even slow it down. Now, you could call that a failure of oversight. You could call it bureaucratic incompetence. You could say that the left hand didn't know what the right hand was doing. But that explanation doesn't hold up, because people within the FBI did know. Morris knew. Other agents suspected. The Drug Enforcement Administration raised concerns. The Massachusetts State Police raised concerns. Boston Police raised concerns. And every time those concerns were raised, they ran into a wall. The wall was the FBI's informant program. The wall was Connolly's relationship with his supervisors. The wall was institutional inertia and career self-preservation, and the simple, terrible fact that nobody wanted to be the person who pulled the thread that unraveled the whole operation. So the murders continued. Some of the victims were criminals themselves. That's true. That's the detail that people use to sand down the edges of this story to make it feel less horrifying. They were bad people anyway. They were in the game. They knew the risks. But some of them weren't. Some of them were people who simply ended up in the wrong proximity to the wrong information. And the distinction, frankly, doesn't matter. Because the issue isn't who the victims were. The issue is that a federal agency created the conditions under which those victims were selected, identified, and eliminated. The FBI didn't pull the trigger, but they loaded the gun, handed it over, pointed at the target, and then wrote a report about how well the program was performing. There's a term in organizational behavior: perverse incentives. It describes what happens when a system's reward structure encourages exactly the behavior the system was designed to prevent. The FBI needed informants to justify its budget, its headcount, its existence. Connolly needed Bulger to justify his career. Bulger needed Connolly to stay out of prison and eliminate his competition. Everyone got what they wanted. Everyone except the people chained to chairs in that South Boston basement. The institutional failure wasn't a mystery. It wasn't hidden. It was just convenient. For enough people, for long enough, that convenience became indistinguishable from policy. December 1994. John Connolly picked up the phone one last time. A federal RICO indictment was coming. The kind of indictment that gathers up everything, every count, every co-conspirator, every year of accumulated evidence, and drops it all at once like a net over the entire organization. Bulger's name was on it. Flemy's name was on it. There was no plea deal that could fix this, no informant status that could shield him. Connolly told Bulger to run. And Whitey Bulger, at 65 years old, after 3 decades of running South Boston like a private kingdom, walked out the door and vanished. Just gone. His longtime girlfriend, Catherine Gregg, went with him. They had cash, they had fake identities, they had a head start that no fugitive should have, because no fugitive is supposed to get a warning call from inside the FBI. The Bureau put him on the 10 most wanted fugitives list. They offered rewards. They ran public service announcements. They distributed wanted posters to every field office in the country. And for 12 years, nothing. 12 years of the most wanted list. 12 years of the world's most well-funded law enforcement agency searching for a man who was living in a rent-controlled apartment in Santa Monica, California. Santa Monica. Not some compound in the mountains, not a bunker in a foreign country. A third-floor apartment in a beachside retirement community in Southern California. He went to the pharmacy. He walked on the beach. He lived, by all accounts, a quiet life of almost aggressive normalcy, while the FBI searched. The capture, when it finally came in June of 2011, was almost anticlimactic. A tip led agents to the apartment. They used a ruse to draw him out. He came to the garage. He was arrested without incident. He was 81 years old. Inside the apartment, agents found $822,000 in cash hidden inside the walls, stuffed into cutouts behind the drywall, and 30 weapons, knives, handguns, rifles, an arsenal that suggested a man who never, for one moment in 16 years of quiet living, stopped expecting the knock at the door. The trial took place in 2013. The prosecution laid out everything. The murders, the extortion, the money laundering, the drug trafficking that Bulger always denied, that he considered beneath him, that the evidence proved he'd engaged in extensively. Witness after witness, former associates who'd flipped, FBI agents who'd been forced to testify about the Bureau's own failures. Bulger was convicted on 31 counts, including 11 murders. He was sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms plus 5 years. He was 84 years old. For 5 years, he sat in various federal facilities. His health declined, wheelchair-bound, heart problems, the kind of slow deterioration that suggested the system would simply wait him out. Let time do what the courts had done. Let entropy finish the sentence. Then, on October 29, 2018, Bulger was transferred, moved from a facility in Florida to USP Hazleton in West Virginia. Hazleton was a different kind of prison. Higher security, more violent. The kind of place where a wheelchair-bound 89-year-old former informant would be, to put it plainly, a target. He arrived on October 29th. Less than 12 hours later, at approximately 6 a.m. on October 30th, 2 inmates entered his cell. What happened next was fast and brutal. Bulger was beaten to death. His eyes were nearly gouged out. A sock was stuffed in his mouth. He was 89 years old, in a wheelchair, and he was beaten until there was nothing left to beat. The symbolism of the eyes wasn't lost on anyone. In prison culture, that's what you do to an informant. You take the eyes that saw too much. You take the mouth that talked too much. It's a message. And the message was received by everyone who was meant to receive it. The question of why Bulger was transferred to Hazleton has never been adequately answered. Who authorized the move? Who decided that an 89-year-old wheelchair-bound inmate should be placed in a facility with a documented history of violence? The Bureau of Prisons conducted an investigation. The results were unsatisfying. So, let's count the agencies. The CIA experimented on him, pumped a young man full of LSD for over a year, studied what happened to his mind, classified the files, and moved on to the next subject. The FBI protected him, gave him a license to operate for 2 decades, fed him intelligence, accepted his bribes, and enabled 11 murders because the metrics looked good on paper. The Bureau of Prisons killed him, transferred a known informant to a facility where his fate was, to anyone paying attention, a certainty. 3 agencies, 1 lifetime, and not a single moment of what could reasonably be called justice. Not for Bulger, not for his victims, not for the families who spent decades waiting for answers that the system was structurally incapable of providing. Hollywood took 2 shots at this story. Johnny Depp played Bulger in Black Mass in 2015. Got the menace right. Got the dead eyes, the quiet voice, the way Bulger could make a dinner table feel like an interrogation room. Martin Scorsese used Bulger as loose inspiration for Jack Nicholson's Frank Costello in The Departed. Got the operatic scope right. The sense that the whole city was compromised, that the rot went all the way through. But neither film touched MKUltra. Neither film showed you a 26-year-old kid in a federal cell, being told the pills would help, being told the hallucinations were part of the treatment, being told to trust the doctors who weren't doctors. And neither film showed you the ending. The wheelchair, the cell at Hazleton, the 6 a.m. visit. They gave you the gangster. They didn't give you the system that built him. Hollywood showed you the gangster. They didn't show you the system that built him. But Bulger's story only scratches the surface of how deep the government-criminal relationship goes. Because in the next story, we meet a man who didn't just work for one side. He worked for all of them, at the same time. Barry Seal was born to fly. July 16th, 1939, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Adler Berriman Seal came into the world in a city that sat low and humid along the Mississippi River, a place where ambition either took you to the oil fields, the State House, or the Y. Young Barry chose the sky, and he chose it early. By 16 years old, an age when most boys in Louisiana are worried about driver's licenses, fishing trips, and Friday night football, Barry Seal earned his student pilot's certificate. Not as a novelty, not as a weekend hobby, as a calling. He logged hours the way other teenagers collected baseball cards, compulsively, hungrily, with a single-mindedness that made the people around him slightly uncomfortable. Because Barry didn't just want to fly, he needed to fly. The way certain musicians describe their relationship with an instrument, not as something they operate, but as something that completes them. He understood aircraft at a cellular level, weight distribution, fuel burn rates, the relationship between altitude and wind shear. He could feel the physics of flight in his hands before the gauges confirmed what his body already knew. And the aviation world noticed. You don't rack up that kind of flight time at that age without people paying attention. By his mid-20s, Barry Seal was one of the youngest 747 captains in the history of Trans-World Airlines. Some accounts place him among the youngest in the entire commercial aviation industry. Let that number sit with you for a moment. 26 years old, and he's sitting in the left seat of the largest commercial aircraft on Earth, responsible for hundreds of passengers crossing the Atlantic Ocean. TWA didn't hand that responsibility to average pilots. They handed it to the exceptional ones, the ones who made the complex look routine and the dangerous look boring. He could fly anything. Cargo planes, commercial jets, single-engine crop dusters, military transports. He understood flight paths and fuel calculations and radar coverage the way a chess grandmaster understands the board. Not just the current position, but every position 3 moves ahead. He knew which altitudes attracted attention. He knew which didn't. He knew the dead zones, the gaps, the corridors where a plane could slip through unnoticed. And it was precisely that knowledge, that extraordinary, almost savant-level understanding of how to move through airspace without being seen, that made him useful to people who needed things moved quietly. Now, here's where the story turns. In the early 1980s, Barry Seal stopped flying passengers and started flying cocaine. Not in suitcases, not in small amounts tucked into carry-on bags. He was transporting plane loads of cocaine from Central America into Louisiana for the Medellin cartel, the most powerful drug organization on Earth, led by Pablo Escobar and the Ochoa brothers. The numbers are staggering. $500,000 per flight. That's $500,000 for a single run. 1,000 to 1,500 kilos per trip, and he was making multiple runs per month. Think about that arithmetic for a moment. At $500,000 per flight, several flights per month, Barry Seal was earning more in a single quarter than most Americans would see in a lifetime. The route threaded from Nicaragua through Central American airspace, across the Gulf of Mexico, and down into remote Louisiana airstrips, so obscure that most law enforcement agencies didn't know they existed. Dirt runways carved out of swampland. No towers, no lights. Just a man in a heavy aircraft, descending through darkness toward a strip he'd memorized from the air. See, what made Seal invaluable to the cartel wasn't just his skill in the cockpit. It was his mind. He was a logistics genius operating in an industry where logistics errors meant either prison or death. He calculated fuel loads so precisely that he could fly routes no other pilot would attempt, landing on strips that most aviators considered suicidal. He understood radar gaps not as static features on a map, but as shifting windows that opened and closed depending on weather, time of day, and military patrol schedules. The Medellin cartel employed plenty of pilots. Pilots were replaceable. They had exactly one Barry Seal, and they knew it. But the cocaine flights were only half the story. And this is where things get genuinely uncomfortable. During this same period, the Reagan administration was fighting a covert war in Central America. The Contras, a rebel group opposing Nicaragua's Sandinista government, needed weapons, supplies, and money. But Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, specifically prohibiting the use of federal funds to support the Contras. The legislation was explicit. No funding, no weapons, no support. Period. So the question became, how do you supply a covert war when Congress has told you, in the clearest possible terms, that you cannot? You find someone who already flies those routes, someone who knows the airstrips, someone who knows how to move cargo without being detected, someone like Barry Seal. The allegation, and it remains one of the most contentious debates in modern American intelligence history, is that a deal was struck. Seal would fly weapons south to the Contra rebels on behalf of the CIA. And what came north on the return flights? Cocaine, funded by the same cartels that were flooding American streets with powder and crack. The CIA has denied this. Seal denied it too, at least publicly. But the circumstantial evidence is substantial, the kind that keeps investigative journalists up at night. Congressional committees convening behind closed doors, and conspiracy theorists gainfully employed for decades. Flight logs, witness testimony. The simple, uncomfortable geography of it all. The same planes, the same routes, the same airstrips, serving two supposedly opposing masters. How does one man work for both the biggest drug cartel in history and the United States government? That's the question that makes Barry Seal's story different from every other drug trafficking case in the 20th century. And nobody, not the CIA, not the DEA, not the courts, not Congress, has ever fully answered it. In 1984, the double life collapsed. Federal authorities caught Barry Seal. The charges were serious. The kind of serious where a man sits across from prosecutors who are counting decades, not years. Drug trafficking, conspiracy, money laundering. The kind of case where you calculate your remaining years of freedom on one hand and come up short. But Barry Seal understands something that most criminals never grasp. Your value to the government isn't determined by your innocence. It's determined by what you know. And Barry Seal knew everything. Routes, contacts, schedules, payment structures, cartel hierarchy, airstrip coordinates, the names of the men who loaded the planes, the names of the men who counted the money, and the names of the men who decided where the money went next. His brain was a filing cabinet of the Medellin cartel's most sensitive operations. And he was the only person on Earth willing to open it. So he made a decision that changed the trajectory of the American drug war. He traveled to Washington, D.C., He walked into a meeting with members of Vice President George H.W. Bush's South Florida Drug Task Force. He sat down across from people who had the authority to put him in prison for the rest of his natural life, and he made them an offer they couldn't refuse. "I'll give you Pablo Escobar." Not low-level dealers, not mid-tier distributors, not the kind of informant intelligence that fills reports but never fills courtrooms. He was offering the leadership of the Medellin cartel. On camera. Documented. Prosecutable. The DEA took the deal. They would have been insane not to. And Barry Seal overnight became the most valuable confidential informant in the history of American drug enforcement. Not one of the most valuable. The most valuable. No informant before or since has operated at the level Seal did. Embedded inside the Medellin cartel's inner circle, with direct access to its leadership, trusted enough to be present for operations that the cartel would kill to keep secret. Now, what happened next is the kind of operation that would strain credibility in a screenplay. CIA technicians were brought in to modify Seal's aircraft. Hidden cameras were installed, miniature lenses concealed in the fuselage, recording equipment disguised within the cargo hold. The plane itself became a surveillance platform. A flying wiretap aimed at the most dangerous men in the Western Hemisphere. Then Seal flew back to work. Same routes, same contacts, same easy, sweating confidence that had kept him alive and useful for years. Except now, every handshake was being photographed. Every cocaine shipment was being documented. Every face that appeared on the tarmac was being catalogued by an intelligence apparatus that stretched from CIA headquarters in Langley to the Justice Department in Washington. And on one particular flight into Nicaragua, Seal captured the photograph. Pablo Escobar, in person. Jose Gonzalo Rodriguez Gacha, the cartel's feared military commander known as El Mexicano, and critically, Federico Vaughn, a man with direct documented connections to Nicaragua's Sandinista government. All of them, right there on camera, physically loading cocaine onto Barry Seal's aircraft. Not supervising from a distance, not standing nearby looking important. Loading it, hands on the product, bricks of cocaine being passed hand over hand into the cargo hold. Those photographs were political dynamite of the highest order. The kind of evidence that doesn't just build cases, it topples governments. It reshapes foreign policy. It changes the conversation in Congress overnight. They didn't just prove the Medellin cartel was trafficking cocaine through Central America. They proved that officials with ties to Nicaragua's leftist government were directly, physically involved in the operation. In the context of the Cold War, with the Reagan administration desperately trying to justify continued support for the Contras, and Congress demanding they stop, those images were worth more than any criminal prosecution. Far, far more. The DEA wanted to use the photographs to build airtight federal cases against the cartel leadership. Methodical, by the book. Years of patient prosecution leading to convictions that would stand up on appeal. The White House wanted to use them tomorrow, to win a political argument, to hold them up before Congress and the American public and say, look, the Sandinistas are in bed with cocaine traffickers. This is why we need the Contras. Two agendas, one set of photographs, and between them, one man whose life depended on nobody knowing he'd taken them. That tension between the patient work of law enforcement and the urgent appetite of politics is a tension as old as government itself. But rarely does it play out with one man's life hanging so clearly in the balance. Someone in the White House leaked Barry Seal's identity to the press. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, because it's the kind of sentence that sounds bureaucratic and procedural, and it is neither of those things. It is a death sentence written in newsprint. The most valuable DEA informant in American history, a man operating inside Pablo Escobar's inner circle, a man who had secretly photographed cartel leaders loading cocaine, was exposed to the world, not by a cartel spy, not by a wiretap intercept, not by some operational failure in the field, by officials within his own government for political advantage. The photographs Seal had risked his life to take were released to the media as part of the Reagan administration's campaign to build congressional and public support for the Contra War and to embarrass the Sandinista government. The story ran: Seal's cover, the cover that was the only thing standing between him and a cartel execution order, was shredded on the front page. No. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to consider the position Barry Seal found himself in, because this is the moment where the story stops being about drug trafficking and starts being about something much darker. You have betrayed the most violent drug cartel in the history of the Western Hemisphere. You have secretly photographed their leaders, including Pablo Escobar himself, in the act of loading cocaine. Your testimony can put them in prison for the rest of their lives. These are men who have bombed airliners, assassinated judges, murdered journalists, and once offered to pay off an entire country's national debt if it meant avoiding extradition. And the government you've been working for, the government that installed cameras on your plane, that flew you to Washington, that shook your hand and promised you a new life, has just published your name in the national press. Meanwhile, your sentencing requires you to sleep at a fixed address every night, a Salvation Army halfway house in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Same building, same parking lot, same curfew, no bodyguards, no alias, no witness protection, no relocation. What would you have done? Barry Seal protested. He went to the DEA, to the prosecutors, to anyone who would listen. And he told them the truth that everyone already knew. He was a dead man. He asked for protection. He asked for a new identity. He asked for a different sentencing arrangement. Anything that didn't involve sleeping at a fixed, public, predictable address every single night like a man waiting for an appointment he couldn't cancel. The terms of his sentence were clear. The halfway house, every night. No exceptions. The federal judge who imposed the conditions apparently weighed Seal's cooperation less heavily than Seal had hoped. And the bureaucratic machinery that could have intervened didn't. The Medellin cartel, meanwhile, had already set its own machinery in motion. They didn't deliberate. They didn't debate. When the cartel learned that Barry Seal had been photographing their operations for the United States government, the response was immediate and absolute. Max Mermelstein, a cartel logistics coordinator who would later become a government informant himself, arranged the contract on Seal's life. The price $1 million if they brought him back alive. 500,000 dead. The cartel preferred him breathing. They had questions they wanted answered, debts they wanted settled, and a message they wanted sent slowly. But a corpse would do. My read? The White House knew exactly what they were doing when they leaked his name. The photographs were more useful as political propaganda than as courtroom evidence, and the man who took them had, in the cold calculus of institutional decision-making, served his purpose. You might disagree. Plenty of historians do. Some argue it was bureaucratic carelessness, not deliberate calculation. Some say the leak came from Congress, not the executive branch. Some say it was inevitable, that Seal's identity would have surfaced eventually through court proceedings anyway. But here's what nobody disputes. After the leak, Barry Seal was a marked man sleeping at a publicly known address, and not a single person in the federal government changed that arrangement. Not one. February 19th, 1986, a Wednesday evening in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The sun has mostly gone down over Airline Highway. The parking lot of the Salvation Army halfway house sits under fluorescent light, half empty, unremarkable. The kind of place you'd drive past 1,000 times without a second glance. Barry Seal pulls his white Cadillac into his usual spot, E-spot. Same time, same routine he's followed every night since his sentencing, because the alternative is a prison cell and the revocation of every deal he's made. He is 46 years old, overweight, balding, exhausted in a way that goes deeper than sleep can fix. The kind of tired that settles into the bones of a man who has spent 5 years calculating whether today is the day the equation catches up with him. He has been a TWA captain, a CIA asset, a Medellin cartel smuggler, earning $500,000 per flight, a DEA informant who secretly photographed Pablo Escobar loading cocaine. He has served 4 institutions, answered to 4 sets of handlers, and satisfied none of them. And now he is sitting in a parking lot, fulfilling the terms of a sentence that reads like a bureaucratic formality and functions like a targeting beacon. 3 Colombian men are already in the parking lot. They've been watching the halfway house for days. The surveillance was almost insultingly simple. No intelligence networks required. No counter-surveillance to defeat. The target arrived at the same location, at the same time, every single night. You could set your watch by it. They approach the Cadillac from behind. Each one carries a MAC-10 submachine gun. Compact, automatic, designed for exactly this kind of close-range, high-volume work. The first rounds come through the driver's side window. Barry Seal collapses against the steering wheel. The shooters empty their magazines into the vehicle, methodically, thoroughly, the way men do when they've been paid well and want to make certain they've earned it. Then they walk to a waiting car and they disappear into the Louisiana evening. Barry Seal was dead at 46. Inside the Cadillac, alongside his body, investigators discovered something that has never been satisfactorily explained. A piece of paper with a phone number written on it. The number belonged to the office of the Vice President of the United States. That fact appears in court records. What it means has been debated for 40 years, and nobody in power has ever provided an answer. The 3 Colombian hitmen were caught, tried, and convicted. The assassination was traced directly back to the Medellin cartel. In one narrow procedural sense, justice was served. But in every other sense, it wasn't. And here's why. Barry Seal's testimony and evidence became the primary foundation of 3 major federal trials. All 3 resulted in convictions. The photographs he risked his life to take, the intelligence he gathered while wearing hidden cameras, the testimony he provided at enormous personal danger. It all produced real, measurable results. The government got exactly what it needed from Barry Seal. What it didn't do was keep him alive long enough to see it. Nobody was ever charged with leaking his identity. The investigation into how a classified DEA informant's name ended up in the national press went nowhere. Quietly shelved. Bureaucratically abandoned. The kind of non-result that, in Washington, tells you everything you need to know. Not that the answer couldn't be found, but that nobody with the authority to find it wanted to look. Now, Tom Cruise played Barry Seal in American Made in 2017. He played him as a grinning flyboy having the time of his life, a charming, reckless cowboy who stumbled sideways into the absurdity of working for both the cartels and the CIA, and who couldn't stop laughing at how ridiculous it all was. The film is entertaining. Cruise is magnetic. The flying sequences are genuinely thrilling. And if you watch it without knowing the real story, you walk away thinking Barry Seal had a pretty wild ride. The real Barry Seal was not Tom Cruise. He was a sweating 300-pound man with a receding hairline who understood that every flight could be his last. He didn't find the absurdity amusing. He found it terrifying. And his story isn't a comedy about a lovable rogue who got in over his head. It's a tragedy about institutional betrayal on a scale that should make you deeply uncomfortable. The CIA used him. The cartel paid him. The DEA turned him. The White House burned him. 4 institutions, 4 agendas. 1 dead man in a parking lot. Somewhere in the classified archives of the federal government, there are documents about Barry Seal that the public has never seen. Somewhere in the institutional memory of American intelligence, there is the quiet, unspoken acknowledgement that a man was placed in a position where his death was not just foreseeable, but inevitable, and nobody with the power to prevent it lifted a finger. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's not even a particularly controversial interpretation. That's a system functioning exactly as designed, using people when they're useful, discarding them when they're not, and filing the paperwork afterward. Look, the drug war has always had 2 stories. The one that gets told in press conferences and courtrooms, where there are heroes and villains, and the good guys eventually win. And the one that plays out in parking lots and classified files and leaked photographs, where the lines between hero and villain dissolve so completely that the only honest label left is participant. Barry Seal lived in the second story. He died there too. Barry Seal's story reveals the machinery behind the drug war, the gears and levers and institutional incentives that connect government agencies, criminal organizations, and political ambitions into a single grinding apparatus where the only thing that matters is utility. The moment you stop being useful, the machinery doesn't protect you. It processes you. But no story demonstrates the gap between Hollywood myth and brutal reality more than the man Netflix spent over $100 million bringing to your screen. Here's a number that doesn't make sense. $420 million per week. Not per year, not per quarter. Per week. That was the revenue stream of one man's operation, running out of a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. His name was Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, born December 1st, 1949, in Rio Negro, a small town in the Antioquia department of Colombia. His father was a farmer. His mother was a schoolteacher. And their son would become, by virtually every metric that exists, the wealthiest criminal in the history of the modern world. Now, Netflix gave you Narcos. And Narcos gave you a version of this man that felt enormous. Wagner Moura sweating through linen shirts, orchestrating chaos from ornate living rooms, whispering threats into telephones. It felt like the biggest story television had ever tried to tell about a drug lord. It wasn't even close to the real one. Let's talk about the actual numbers, because the actual numbers break your brain. 15 tons of cocaine smuggled into the United States every single day, not every month, every day. At peak operation, the Medellin cartel controlled roughly 80% of the global cocaine trade. Escobar's personal net worth sat at an estimated $30 billion, which earned him a spot on the Forbes list of international billionaires for 7 consecutive years, from 1987 to 1993. Forbes, the same magazine that tracks Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. They were tracking a cocaine trafficker from Antioquia, Colombia, and they couldn't leave him off the list because the math wouldn't let them. He spent $2,500 a month on rubber bands, just rubber bands, to hold the cash together. His organization was burying money in Colombian farmland, storing it in warehouse walls, losing roughly 10% of annual revenue, billions of dollars, to water damage, rats, and simple rot. They were making money faster than they could physically count it. So, what do you do with that kind of wealth, besides lose it to rodents? You build Hacienda Napolis. 7,000 acres of private estate, $63 million in construction, a private airstrip long enough to land cargo planes, a full-sized bullfighting arena, multiple artificial lakes, a soccer field, because, of course, life-sized dinosaur statues dotting the property like lawn ornaments. Because when you have $30 billion, historical accuracy in your landscaping is optional. And then there was the zoo, a private, fully operational zoo stocked with elephants, giraffes, ostriches, and this will matter later, so remember it, 4 hippopotamuses imported directly from Africa. The Cessna that Escobar supposedly used for his very first cocaine shipment to the United States. He mounted it above the entrance gate of Hacienda Napoles, the way a fisherman mounts a trophy bass above his fireplace. Except this trophy represented the first flight of a $30 billion empire. But the estate was just the visible part. The machinery underneath was something else entirely. Plata o plomo, silver or lead. You've heard the phrase if you've watched any narco film ever made, but the phrase wasn't a catchphrase. It was a governance model. Escobar didn't just bribe officials. He systematically corrupted entire branches of the Colombian government. Judges, prosecutors, police commanders, military officers, politicians. You took the money, or you took the bullet. There was no third option. There was no, "I'll think about it." The binary was absolute. And it worked so thoroughly that in 1982, Pablo Escobar was elected as an alternate member of the Colombian Congress, a sitting cocaine trafficker, walking the halls of government with diplomatic immunity. He'd built low-income housing in Medellin neighborhoods, funded soccer fields in the barrios, handed out cash to the poor like a narco Robin Hood. The people loved him, the politicians feared him, and the institutions of Colombian democracy simply absorbed him. This is the part where Narcos starts to feel small, because the show gave you a powerful man. The reality was a parallel state. But the most surprising part isn't what Narcos showed you. It's what they left out. Eric Newman is an honest man. You have to give him that. Newman was the showrunner of Narcos, the architect of the series, the person most responsible for how the world now pictures Pablo Escobar, which is to say, how the world pictures Wagner Moura. And in interviews, Newman was remarkably candid about what he'd built. He described the show's relationship to historical truth as roughly 50-50, 50% real, 50% invented. For a show that marketed itself as the definitive account of the Medellin cartel, 50-50. Now, nobody expects a Netflix drama to function as a documentary. That's reasonable, but the problem with Narcos wasn't that it took creative liberties. The problem was that it took creative liberties so confidently that an entire generation now carries false memories of events that never happened, spoken by people who never existed. Let's start with the big one. Colonel Horacio Carrillo, the relentless, morally complex Colombian police officer who serves as one of the show's central figures across multiple seasons. Intense, driven, willing to cross ethical lines in pursuit of Escobar. Audiences invested deeply in his arc, debated his choices, mourned his fate. He never existed. Carrillo was a composite character assembled primarily from the real biography of Colonel Hugo Martinez, who led the search block, the specialized unit tasked with hunting Escobar. But Martinez's actual story was apparently not dramatic enough, or not shaped correctly for television, so the writers built a fictional officer and gave him a fictional name and fictional storylines, while presenting him inside a framework that constantly reminded viewers this was based on true events. Then there's Javier Pena, Pedro Pascal's character, the DEA agent, who became the show's moral center in its later seasons, particularly during the pivot to the Cali cartel storyline. Pascal was magnetic in the role. Critics loved him. The performance was genuinely excellent. But the real Javier Pena had no involvement whatsoever in the Cali cartel investigation. The show invented his entire second-act arc, whole cloth. The real Pena's operational scope was the Medellin cartel, full stop. Extending his character into the Cali narrative was a storytelling decision, not a historical one. It made for better television. It made for worse history. And then there were the personal details, the intimate moments that gave the show its emotional texture. Narcos depicted a scene where Escobar's widow, met with Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela, the head of the Cali cartel, implying a kind of negotiated transition of power, a passing of the narco torch. Dramatic, compelling, entirely fictional. After Escobar's death, his widow, Maria Victoria Henao, didn't sit down with rival cartel leaders. She fled. First to Mozambique, of all places, then eventually to Argentina, where she lived under an assumed name, trying to disappear from a legacy that wouldn't stop following her. The reality was fear and displacement. The show gave you a power meeting. Perhaps the most telling critique came from someone who would know. Sebastian Marroquin, born Juan Pablo Escobar, Pablo's own son, who changed his name to escape his father's shadow. Marroquin published a detailed list of 28 specific inaccuracies in the series. 28 that he could identify and articulate. He called the show's portrayal of his family insulting. 28 errors from the man who was literally in the room. That's not nitpicking. That's a rebuttal. Here's what's interesting about all of this. It's not that Narcos was bad television. It was exceptional television. The performances were extraordinary. The cinematography was lush. The pacing was addictive. And that is precisely the problem. Because when you make something that compelling, that watchable, that beautifully produced, it doesn't just entertain, it overwrites. This is the mythology machine at work. Hollywood doesn't document drug lords. It creates them. It takes men who are brutal, crude, and often far less charismatic than anyone wants to believe, and it renders them in amber. It gives them better dialogue than they ever actually spoke, better wardrobes than they ever actually wore, more complex motivations than they ever actually had. Wagner Moura's Escobar deliberates. He broods. He weighs moral costs. The real Escobar ordered a commercial airliner bombed out of the sky to kill one person. The show wanted you to understand him. The truth only asks that you see him clearly. November 27th, 1989. Avianca Flight 203. A Boeing 727, domestic route, Bogota to Cali. 107 passengers and crew. The bomb was placed on board by a man who'd been instructed to sit near the front of the aircraft. He didn't know it would detonate 5 minutes after takeoff. He thought he was carrying a recording device, supposedly to capture a conversation for intelligence purposes. He died with everyone else. 110 people total, including 3 American citizens, all because Escobar believed that Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, the leading presidential candidate and a vocal supporter of extraditing drug traffickers to the United States, was on the flight. Gaviria wasn't on the flight. He'd changed his travel plans. 110 people for a target who wasn't even there. This is the part of the Escobar story that resists dramatization. Not because it isn't dramatic. It's almost incomprehensibly dramatic. But because the scale of violence was so systematic, so indiscriminate, that turning it into narrative entertainment requires softening it. And Narcos did soften it. Had to soften it. Because the unfiltered version doesn't feel like television. It feels like a war, which is exactly what it was. 1 month after the Avianca bombing, a truck loaded with 500 kilograms of dynamite detonated outside the DAS building, Colombia's equivalent of the FBI and CIA combined. The explosion killed 63 people, injured over 600, and destroyed the building. Escobar's target was the DAS director, General Miguel Massa Marquez. Maza survived. 63 others did not. The Colombian government's response was the Search Block, a specialized military and police unit funded and advised by the United States with a single operational objective: find and capture Pablo Escobar. At its peak, the Search Block deployed hundreds of personnel, supported by American intelligence assets, electronic surveillance equipment, and CIA advisory teams operating on Colombian soil. One man, hundreds of soldiers, 2 governments, satellites, and it still wasn't enough. So they found additional help. Los Pepes, perseguidos por Pablo Escobar. Persecuted by Pablo Escobar, a vigilante paramilitary group that emerged in 1993, targeting Escobar's properties, businesses, associates, lawyers, and family members. They burned his ranches. They killed his lieutenants. They dismantled his support network with a ruthlessness that matched his own. The official position of both the Colombian and American governments was that Los Pepes operated independently, that the Search Block and Los Pepes were separate entities with no coordination. Nobody believed this, then or now. Because Los Pepes had connections to the Cali Cartel, Escobar's primary rival organization, and the Cali Cartel had connections to Colombian military and intelligence officials who were, simultaneously, working alongside American advisors in the Search Block. The boundaries between legal and illegal, between state and cartel, between justice and vengeance, they dissolved completely. The Colombian government effectively allied with one drug cartel to destroy another. The midnight magnates who were here for the Wall Street episode might recognize this pattern. When you destroy one node in the network, the money just finds a new route. Sit with that for a moment. The full apparatus required to bring down one cocaine trafficker from Antioquia. The Colombian military, the Colombian National Police, a specialized hunter-killer unit. The United States Central Intelligence Agency, the United States Drug Enforcement Administration, Delta Force operators, a rival drug cartel, and a paramilitary death squad with ties to both the cartel and the government. All of that for one man. Everyone remembers how Escobar died. Almost nobody asks the more revealing question: why it took an entire country, 2 rival cartels, and the United States government to bring down a single individual. What kind of power structure requires that coalition to dismantle? What does it say about the systems that created him? The demand for cocaine in American cities, the corruption infrastructure in Colombian institutions, the banking networks that laundered his billions, that removing the man at the top required a small war? The answer is uncomfortable. The answer is that Escobar wasn't an aberration in the system. He was a symptom of it. December 2nd, 1993. One day after his 44th birthday. The call that killed Pablo Escobar lasted approximately 6 minutes. He was hiding in a middle-class neighborhood in Medellin, in a modest 2-story house, a far cry from Hacienda Nápoles. Colombian electronic surveillance teams, working with American signals intelligence, had been triangulating his cell phone for weeks. Every time he called his son, they got closer. His security protocol required calls under 3 minutes. He knew this. His people knew this. Everyone knew the clock was running. But on December 2nd, he stayed on the line, talking to his boy. 6 minutes. The Search Block assault team converged on the building within hours. Escobar and his bodyguard attempted to escape across the rooftops. Gunfire erupted. The bodyguard was killed. Escobar was shot through the leg, through the torso, and through the ear. The final shot. He collapsed on a clay tile roof in a neighborhood called Los Olivos. The photographs from that afternoon show Colombian security forces posing with the body, smiling, the mustache visible, the blue polo shirt dark with blood. The images circled the globe within hours before the internet existed to spread them. Wire services, front pages. The man who'd terrorized a nation for a decade and a half, finally still. The war was over. The war changed nothing. Within 18 months of Escobar's death, the Cali cartel, the same organization that had helped destroy him, had absorbed the majority of his distribution networks. The cocaine kept flowing. The volume barely dipped. When Colombian and American authorities subsequently dismantled the Cali cartel in the mid-1990s, the vacuum was filled by smaller Colombian trafficking organizations, which were themselves eventually subordinated by Mexican cartels. Sinaloa, Juarez, Gulf, Tijuana. The names changed. The supply chain didn't. This is what Narcos ultimately couldn't tell you, not because the showrunners didn't understand it, but because it's not a satisfying ending. Television needs resolution. The audience needs to feel that the story meant something, that the sacrifice and violence led somewhere. But the cocaine trade didn't end with a body on a rooftop. It didn't even pause. The most honest version of the Escobar story doesn't end with his death. It ends with a graph line, cocaine entering the United States, that barely registers a blip in 1993 and continues rising through the late 90s, the 2000s, the 2010s, right up to today. But perhaps the strangest story of Pablo Escobar's legacy isn't about cocaine at all. Remember the hippos? When Hacienda Nápoles was seized by the Colombian government after Escobar's death, most of the exotic animals from his private zoo were relocated. The elephants, the giraffes, the ostriches, they were transferred to proper facilities or donated to zoos around the country. Logistically complex, but manageable. Nobody could figure out what to do with the hippos. 4 hippopotamuses, 2 tons each, aggressive, semi-aquatic, native to sub-Saharan Africa, now standing in the warm rivers of the Magdalena Medio region of Colombia. There was no zoo equipped to take them. Transporting a 2-ton hippo requires specialized equipment, veterinary sedation protocols, and infrastructure that simply didn't exist in 1990s Colombia. So the government did what governments do when faced with an expensive problem that isn't an immediate crisis. They left them. The hippos bred. Of course they bred. Colombia's tropical climate, abundant waterways, and complete absence of natural predators created a perfect environment. No lions, no droughts, no competition, just warm rivers, lush vegetation, and absolute biological freedom. By 2007, the population had grown to 16. By 2020, estimates ranged from 80 to over 100. By 2023, approximately 200 feral hippopotamuses were roaming the Colombian countryside. 200 from 4. They've displaced native manatees. They've altered river ecosystems. They've attacked local fishermen. They've wandered into small towns, standing in intersections like confused tourists, while residents scatter. The Colombian government has spent millions attempting various solutions: contraceptive darts, relocation programs, Sterilization efforts, none of it has been sufficient to control the population growth. Pablo Escobar's last empire, still growing, still uncontrollable. Still, 3 decades after his death, reshaping the landscape of a country he once held hostage. Not with bullets or bribes or cocaine, but with hippos, wandering the rivers, breeding in the shallows, a living, breathing, 2-ton monument to the law of unintended consequences. He would have found this hilarious. That's perhaps the most unsettling part. The cocaine trade moved on. The cartels evolved. The money found new routes, new names, new faces. Colombia rebuilt, imperfectly but persistently, around the scars of a war that consumed 40,000 lives. The Escobar mythology was absorbed into Hollywood, processed into content, and sold back to the world as entertainment. Wagner Moura won awards. Netflix got subscribers. The cycle completed itself. But the hippos remain in the rivers, in the fields, in the slow, warm afternoons of rural Antioquia, the one legacy that nobody predicted, and nobody can undo. Escobar made billions on the ground. He corrupted a government, waged war on a nation, and left behind an ecological crisis shaped like a hippopotamus. But the man in our next story, he owned the skies. Let me give you a number. 30. 30 Boeing 727 jetliners, commercial aircraft, the kind of plane you've been on to visit your family for Thanksgiving. The kind with rows of seats and overhead bins and that little ding when the captain turns off the seatbelt sign. Now imagine all those seats ripped out. Every overhead bin, every galley cart, every lavatory partition, stripped to the fuselage, and in their place, 70 tons of cocaine per aircraft, 30 planes, 70 tons each. Purchased from a bankrupt airline in Belize that had no idea, or perhaps didn't care, what its fleet would become. The man who owned them was born Amado Carrillo Fuentes, December 17th, 1954, a small town in Sinaloa, Mexico, where the options for young men were farming, poverty, or the trade. And in Sinaloa, the trade only means one thing. His family was already connected. Not famous, not powerful, but connected in the way that matters in that part of the world, through relationships, through cousins and uncles who knew people who moved things across borders. It was the family business before it was his business. He just happened to be better at it than anyone who came before him. At the time of his death, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was worth an estimated $25 billion. Let me put that in perspective. In 1997, the gross domestic product of Iceland was roughly $25 billion. This man, a drug trafficker from rural Mexico, had accumulated personal wealth equivalent to the entire economic output of a sovereign European nation. Every fish caught, every aluminum smelted, every tourist dollar spent in the whole of Iceland for an entire year. That was Amado's bank balance. They called him El Señor de los Cielos, the Lord of the Skies. And I want to be clear about something. That wasn't a metaphor. That wasn't a colorful nickname dreamed up by journalists or screenwriters. It was a literal description of what this man built. He controlled the air above the drug trade. While other traffickers were still hiding kilos in car tires and fishing boats, Amado Carrillo Fuentes was operating a commercial aviation fleet. Now, how does a man from Sinaloa end up running the Juarez cartel, one of the most powerful criminal organizations on the planet? The answer is remarkably direct. In 1993, the Juarez cartel was controlled by a man named Rafael Aguilar Guajardo. He was Amado's boss, his mentor, the man who had brought him into the organization and trusted him with increasing responsibility. Amado had him killed. There's no ambiguity about this, no disputed accounts, no some historians believe. He ordered the assassination of his own boss, stepped over the body, and took control of the entire operation. In corporate terms, it was a hostile takeover. In cartel terms, it was Tuesday. 30 Boeing 727s. Most airlines don't have 3727s. He wasn't running a drug operation. He was running an airline that happened to also commit crimes. The baggage fees were extraordinary. The in-flight service was non-existent, but the profit margins? Well, $25 billion suggests the business model was sound. Here's what made Amado Carrillo Fuentes different from every other drug lord in this story. Pablo Escobar's a force of personality, a man who bent Colombia to his will through violence, bribery, and sheer audacity. El Chapo was an engineer. Tunnels, submarines, hidden compartments. George Young was a middleman who happened to know the right people at the right time. But Amado was a systems thinker. He didn't just move drugs, he built infrastructure. The Colombia to Mexico to United States air bridge was his masterpiece. Here's how it worked. Cocaine was produced in Colombia, primarily by the Medellin and Cali cartels. The problem was getting it into the United States, where the profit margins exploded. Direct routes from Colombia to the U.S. were heavily monitored. The Coast Guard, the DEA, military radar. The Americans had spent billions trying to close that corridor. So Amado offered an alternative. Mexico. His fleet of Boeing 727s would fly from Colombia to remote airstrips in the Mexican desert. Enormous quantities, not kilos, tons. The cocaine would then be transported overland across the U.S.-Mexico border using the Juarez cartel's existing smuggling routes. Border crossings, tunnels, trucks disguised as legitimate cargo. The brilliance was in the division of labor. The Colombians handled production. Amado handled the middle mile, the most dangerous, most complex, most vulnerable link in the chain. And then his ground teams handled the last mile into American cities. What's remarkable, and I use that word deliberately because this is observation, not admiration, is that Amado served as the logistics backbone for both major Colombian cartels simultaneously. The Medellin cartel and the Cali cartel were rivals, enemies. They killed each other's people. They competed for territory, for routes, for political protection. But they both needed Amado Carrillo Fuentes to get their product to market. Think about that. He was FedEx. He didn't care what was in the package or who sent it. He just guaranteed delivery. And both sides paid him because the alternative, building their own air fleet, bribing their own Mexican officials, establishing their own desert airstrips, was more expensive and less reliable than hiring the man who had already done it. His network of contacts stretched from Mexico City to Washington, D.C. Generals on the payroll, governors who looked the other way, federal police commanders who provided advance warning of operations, intelligence officials who shared classified information about DEA investigations. The level of sophistication would have impressed most legitimate businesses. He ran counter-surveillance operations. He had intelligence capabilities that rivaled some government agencies. His communication security was, for a time, essentially unbreakable. There's a concept in business strategy called competitive moat, the thing that prevents competitors from replicating your advantage. For most companies, it's patents, or brand loyalty, or economies of scale. For Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the moat was relationships. Decades of cultivated trust with military commanders, political officials, and cartel leaders across 2 countries. You can buy a Boeing 727. You cannot buy the network of corrupt officials who guarantee it lands safely. Innovation under constraint. That's the phrase that keeps coming back in these stories. When the penalty for failure isn't a quarterly loss, but a shallow grave in the desert, the solutions tend to be creative. Amado didn't fight the system. He bought the system. And then he made the system work for him at a scale that turned cocaine trafficking into something resembling, well, an actual airline. Independence Day in the United States. Fireworks over every city. Families gather barbecues. The whole country celebrating freedom. In a private hospital in Mexico City, a different kind of independence was being attempted. Amado Carrillo Fuentes checked in under a false name for an 8-hour plastic surgery procedure. The goal was total facial reconstruction. New cheekbones, new jawline, new nose. A different man walking out than the one who walked in. At $25 billion, with every law enforcement agency in the Western Hemisphere looking for you, your face becomes your most dangerous liability. Change the face. Change the future. The official story is straightforward. He died on the operating table. Complications from the anesthesia combined with the extreme length and invasiveness of the procedures. An 8-hour surgery is grueling on any body. On a man who had spent decades under extraordinary stress, whose cardiovascular health was likely compromised by the lifestyle. It was too much. That's the official story. Now, let me tell you what happened. 4 months later, November 1997. The 2 surgeons who performed the operation on Amado Carrillo Fuentes were found dead. Their bodies had been encased in concrete inside steel drums. There were signs of extensive torture before death. Stop there. Think about what that means. If the surgery failed, if Amado truly died on the table from complications, why kill the surgeons? What purpose does that serve? You don't torture and murder doctors because their patient didn't survive an operation. That's not how even the most violent cartels operate. Medical failures happen. The cartels understand risk. You only kill the surgeons if the surgery succeeded. You kill the surgeons because they saw the new face, because they are the only people on Earth who can connect the old identity to the new one. Because as long as those 2 doctors are breathing, Amado Carrillo Fuentes is still traceable, still identifiable, still tethered to his former life. The concrete, the steel drums, the torture, that wasn't punishment for failure. That was the elimination of witnesses. Now, I want to be careful here. Because what I've just described is an interpretation, not a confirmed fact. The Mexican government conducted an autopsy and determined that Amado Carrillo Fuentes died from the surgery. A body was produced. A funeral was held. The case was officially closed. But DNA testing in 1997 Mexico was not what it is today. The technology was rudimentary. The chain of custody for evidence in a case involving the most powerful drug lord in the country, with billions of dollars at stake and corrupt officials at every level of government. Well, let's say the opportunities for interference were abundant. The Netflix series Narcos. Mexico explored this question directly. In its final season, the show implies, without confirming, that Amado may have faked his death, that the body on the table was someone else's, that the Lord of the Skies walked out of that hospital with a new face and vanished into a world where $25 billion can buy you anything, including a second life. Did Amado Carrillo Fuentes die on July 4th, 1997? Or did he walk out of that hospital as a different man entirely? Nobody knows for certain. And the only two people who could have answered that question were found in steel drums, sealed in concrete, 4 months later. Some exits are permanent, and some exits are designed to look permanent. Whether Amado died or disappeared, the effect on the Juarez cartel was the same. His brother, Vicente Carlo Fuentes, assumed control, and by every measure that matters, the organization never recovered. It's not that Vicente was incompetent. He was a capable man in a world that demanded more than capable. He had the name. He had the infrastructure. He had the Boeing fleet, or what remained of it. What he did not have was Amado's network. Those relationships with generals and governors and intelligence officials, those belonged to Amado personally. They were handshake deals, trust built over decades of shared risk and shared profit. You can inherit a cartel. You cannot inherit the trust that held it together. Without Amado's connections, without his ability to guarantee safe passage through Mexican airspace, without his political protection at the highest levels of government, without his reputation as the man who never failed to deliver, the Juarez cartel began to fracture. Rival organizations sensed weakness. The Sinaloa cartel, under a rising figure named Joaquin Guzman, El Chapo, began pushing into Juarez territory. What followed was a decade of violence that turned Ciudad Juarez into one of the most dangerous cities on the planet. At its peak, the murder rate was staggering. Bodies in the streets, mass graves in the desert, journalists killed for reporting the truth, police officers assassinated for doing their jobs, or assassinated for not doing what the cartels demanded. The cartel wars that consumed Juarez after Amado's death were not caused by one man's absence. The drug trade is too complex, too driven by market forces and political dynamics for any single explanation. But the power vacuum he left was real, and filling a vacuum in the drug world requires blood. Hollywood found the story irresistible. Jose Maria Yazbek portrayed Amado Carrillo Fuentes in Narcos, Mexico, and the performance captured something essential about the man, not the violence. There are plenty of violent characters in that series. But the calm, the boardroom energy, the sense that this was a man who saw himself not as a criminal, but as a businessman, operating in a market that happened to be illegal. Jaspik played him with a quiet confidence that made the character more unsettling than any screaming kingpin with a gold-plated pistol. The Telemundo series El Señor de los Cielos took a different approach, more melodramatic, more telenovela in structure, but it reached an enormous audience across Latin America. For millions of Spanish-speaking viewers, that show is Amado Carrillo Fuentes. The real man has been replaced by the fictional version, which, if you think about it, is exactly what happened with Escobar and Narcos. The gap between myth and reality is wider with Amado than with almost anyone else in this story. Television made him a character, a dramatic figure in a world of dramatic figures. But the real Amado Carrillo Fuentes was closer to a Fortune 500 CEO who happened to traffic cocaine. He didn't wave guns around. He didn't make theatrical threats. He sat in meetings. He analyzed logistics. He calculated costs per kilogram per mile and negotiated volume discounts with Colombian producers. The man ran spreadsheets. Probably not literal spreadsheets. But the thinking was corporate, strategic, patient. And that's what makes his story sit differently from the others. Escobar wanted to be president. El Chapo wanted to be famous. George Jung wanted to live the good life. But Amado? My read is that Amado simply wanted to build the most efficient operation possible. The empire was the point, not the lifestyle, not the legend, the system. Whether he's dead or alive, whether he's been a ghost for nearly 30 years, or whether he genuinely drew his last breath on that operating table in Mexico City, the system he built reshaped the entire geography of the drug trade. Before Amado, cocaine moved through the Caribbean. After Amado, it moved through Mexico. That shift, that single strategic redirection, is responsible for the rise of every Mexican cartel that dominates the drug trade today. The Lord of the Skies. Not a metaphor, not an exaggeration. A job description. Carrillo Fuentes turned drug smuggling into an airline. But the man who taught Pablo Escobar how to sell cocaine in America started from much humbler beginnings. George Jacob Jung was born on August 6, 1942, in a working-class neighborhood in Weymouth, Massachusetts, just south of Boston. His father was a blue-collar man who worked hard, came home tired, and never quite had enough. His mother wanted more. And George sat at the kitchen table and watched his parents argue about money. Not once. Not occasionally. Constantly. The rent, the groceries, the car payment, the school clothes. The same quiet, grinding desperation that eats through a family the way rust eats through a car frame. Slowly, completely, until there's nothing structural left. And George, watching this, made a decision. A simple one. The kind of decision a kid makes before he understands what it will cost. He decided that being poor was not an option. Not, I'd rather not be poor. Not, I hope I'm not poor. He decided it the way some people decide to breathe. It became the foundation of everything that came after. And like most foundations built in childhood, it held up the entire building, including the parts that would eventually collapse. In the early 1960s, Jung moved to California. He was young, restless, and exactly the kind of person the West Coast was designed for. Sun, freedom, opportunity, and a culture that didn't particularly care where the money came from, as long as you were having a good time spending it. He started small. Marijuana, buying it in Mexico, driving it across the border in quantities that were, by later standards, almost quaint. A trunk full here, a few duffel bags there. The kind of operation you'd run out of a college dorm if you had slightly more ambition than sense. And for a while, it worked. The money came. Not millions, not yet, but enough. Enough to never sit at that kitchen table again. Enough to feel like he'd escaped the gravity of Weymouth, Massachusetts. But Jung had something that most small-time smugglers didn't, a natural understanding of the American market. He knew who wanted what, where they wanted it, and how much they'd pay. He could read a city the way a stockbroker reads a ticker. He was a salesman, a natural distributor, and in an industry with no business schools, no MBAs, and no quarterly reviews. That instinct was worth more than any degree. The quantities grew. Trunks became cars. Cars became trucks. Trucks became planes. By the mid-1970s, George Jung was running plane loads of marijuana from Mexico into the United States. Not bad for a kid from Weymouth who started by watching his parents argue about the electric bill. Then, in 1974, it stopped. Federal agents caught up with him. He was arrested, convicted, and sentenced to time at FCI Danbury in Connecticut, a federal correctional institution. The kind of place where the government sends you when it wants you to think about what you've done. And this is where the story takes a turn that, if you wrote it in a screenplay, the producer would say, it's too convenient, too neat, too perfectly engineered. Because at FCI Danbury, George Jung was assigned a cellmate, a Colombian-German man named Carlos Lehder. Now, let me describe what the federal prison system accidentally created in that cell. George Jung understood the American distribution landscape. He knew the buyers, the routes, the cities, the prices, and the appetites of an entire country. What he didn't have was a supply chain. He was a salesman without a warehouse. Carlos Lehder understood the Colombian supply chain. He had connections to the cocaine producers in Colombia. What he didn't have was an American distribution network. He was a warehouse without a salesman. The United States government took a marketing director and a supply chain manager, put them in the same room, and was somehow surprised when they started a company. They spent their time in that cell designing what would become one of the most successful cocaine distribution networks in American history. Not in a boardroom, not on a whiteboard, in a prison cell, on a bunk bed, with nothing but time and complementary skill sets. The irony is so thick, you could choke on it. The federal prison system, designed to stop crime, became the incubator for a cocaine empire that would flood an entire nation with product. The system built to contain the problem produced the problem. And when they both walked out of Danbury, they had a plan. A complete, detailed blueprint for importing cocaine into the United States at a scale nobody had attempted before. 2 men, 1 cell, 1 plan, and a federal government that paid for the room and board while they drew it up. Sometimes the system doesn't just fail to prevent the problem. It hosts the meeting where the problem is designed. After his release, George Jung traveled to Colombia, and through Carlos Lehder, he walked into a world he could barely comprehend. The Medellin cartel, Pablo Escobar, the largest cocaine operation in the history of the world. Now, let's be precise about Jung's position here. Because the movie Blow, with Johnny Depp looking handsome and confident and in control, gives you the impression that Jung was a major player, a partner, someone who sat at the table with Escobar as an equal. He wasn't. George Jung was never in a circle. He was the middleman, the bridge. The man who connected Colombian cocaine with American noses. He was useful because he had what the Colombians needed: access to the most lucrative drug market on Earth. He understood the geography, the distribution points, the wholesale buyers, and the retail networks that could move product at scale. That made him valuable. It did not make him powerful. And that distinction is everything. There's a difference between being the man who makes the product and the man who delivers it. The producer sets the terms. The delivery man fills the orders. The delivery man is essential right up until the moment someone else can do it cheaper, or faster, or without asking so many questions. Remember that. It matters later. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, nobody else could do it. Not like Jung could. And the scale was staggering. Jung would later claim that he imported roughly 85% of all cocaine entering the United States during his peak years. 85% of all cocaine consumed by 300 million people. Now, that number is almost certainly exaggerated. Jung was many things, but modest was not one of them. He was a storyteller. He understood that the legend is part of the business. The bigger the number, the more important you sound. The more important you sound, the more people want to work with you. It's marketing, just for cocaine. But even if you cut that claim in half, even if you say it was 40%, you're still talking about one man serving as the primary gateway for nearly half the cocaine consumed by an entire nation. The money was, well, it was the kind of money that stops being money and starts being a logistics problem. Millions of dollars in cash. More cash than you can count. More cash than you can store. More cash than the banking system can absorb without someone asking questions. Jung was stuffing it in walls, burying it in backyards, flying it out of the country in suitcases. The classic problem of the successful drug trafficker: the product is easy to move, but the profit is impossible to hide. And with that money came the lifestyle, the mansions, the parties, the women, the private planes, the absolute, intoxicating, chemically pure feeling of being untouchable, of walking through the world knowing that you have more money than anyone in the room, that the rules don't apply to you, that the system you grew up resenting is now something you've beaten. Remember that kid at the kitchen table, the one watching his parents fight about money? He wasn't watching anymore. He was drowning in the stuff. The midnight magnates, who were here for the Wall Street episode, might recognize this phase. It's the same phase in every empire. The expansion period, the golden age, the stretch of time where everything works and nothing has consequences. And the future looks like an infinite upward line on a graph. But here's what every person who's ever built something unsustainable eventually learns. The drug trade doesn't have a plateau. It doesn't level off at a comfortable altitude where you cruise and enjoy the view. It has a peak and a cliff. And by the mid-1980s, George Jung was standing on the edge of that cliff, looking down at a drop he couldn't see the bottom of. His Colombian connections were tightening. The cartel was learning that they didn't need an American middleman. They could build their own distribution networks. The delivery man was becoming replaceable. His relationships were fracturing. The money that was supposed to fix everything was destroying everything. His marriage, his friendships, his grip on reality. When you have more cocaine than a pharmacy and more cash than a bank, the line between confidence and delusion disappears entirely. And his partner, Carlos Lehder, was getting reckless. The man who'd shared a prison cell with Jung and designed an empire on a bunk bed was building a different kind of empire now, one with neo-Nazi ideology, a private island, and the kind of attention that attracts federal prosecutors the way a porch light attracts moths. The peak was over, and gravity doesn't negotiate. What happened next is a story about loyalty, about betrayal, about the only exit door the drug trade offers, and what it costs to walk through it. In 1987, Carlos Lehder was arrested and extradited to the United States. The man who had revolutionized cocaine transportation, who had turned a Bahamian island into a narcotics supermarket, who had been called the Henry Ford of cocaine by federal prosecutors, was now sitting in an American courtroom facing charges that could put him away for the rest of his natural life, and the government needed witnesses. They looked at the man who knew Lehder best, the man who had shared a cell with him, built an empire with him, traveled to Colombia with him, the man who understood, from the inside, exactly how the operation worked, who could explain to a jury, in plain American English, how cocaine moved from a Colombian jungle to an American nostril. George Jung. The government didn't come to him with a request. They came with arithmetic. 60 years versus 20. The rest of your life in a cell versus walking out before you're old. Simple math, brutal math, the kind of math that strips away every principle you thought you had and shows you what's actually underneath. Now, before I tell you what he decided, consider the position he was in. He could stay loyal, refuse to testify, maintain the only code of honor the drug trade recognizes, and spend the rest of his life in a federal prison, 60 years. That was the sentence hanging over him. 60 years. He would die in a cell. Or he could testify, cooperate, give the government everything they needed to bury his former partner, and in exchange, he would keep his life. Or at least, the years remaining in it. His sentence would be reduced. He would eventually walk free. He could stay loyal and die in prison. Or he could testify and keep his life, but lose everything that gave it meaning. Half the people hearing this would have chosen loyalty. The other half would have chosen survival. Both sides have their logic. History only records what he actually did. Jung testified, and his testimony was devastating. He described the operation from the inside, the supply chain, The distribution network, the money, the flights, the connections. He gave federal prosecutors exactly what they needed to build an airtight case against the man who had once been his closest partner, his cellmate, his co-architect of an empire that flooded a nation with cocaine. Lehder was convicted, sentenced to life, plus 135 years. Life, plus 135 years. The kind of sentence that isn't really a sentence, it's a statement. It says, "You will never see the outside of these walls again," and Jung helped make it happen. The man who had sat across from Lehder on a prison bunk, who had sketched out routes and distribution plans and dreamed of an empire, helped bury him. But here's the cost. In the drug trade, there is one currency that matters more than cash, more than cocaine, more than connections. Trust. And once you testify against a partner, that currency is gone, permanently, irrevocably. You cannot unring that bell. Jung had severed the last connection to his old life. The cartel wouldn't touch him now, not because they forgave him, but because he was no longer worth the trouble. He was used up, spent. A man who had once been the bridge between Colombian cocaine and American demand was now just another cooperating witness in a government database. His sentence was reduced. 60 years became roughly 20. That's the math of betrayal in the federal system. 40 years of freedom in exchange for the one thing the drug trade never forgives. But Jung wasn't done making mistakes, because on November 14th, 1994, he was arrested again in Topeka, Kansas, with 1,754 pounds of cocaine. Let me just let that number sit for a moment. After testifying against his partner, after cooperating with the government, after having his sentence reduced specifically because he agreed to leave the drug trade behind, he was caught with nearly a ton of cocaine. I think this was the moment it all became clear, not just to the courts, not just to the prosecutors, but to Jung himself. He wasn't a businessman who sold cocaine. He was a man who couldn't stop. The kid from Weymouth who decided poverty wasn't an option had built his entire identity around the trade. Take away the cocaine, and there was nothing underneath. No foundation, no alternative self. Just a man standing in a kitchen watching his parents argue about money. The court was not sympathetic. You might imagine why. He'd had his chance. The government had given him the one thing the drug trade doesn't offer: a second act, a reduced sentence, a path back to something resembling a normal life. And he'd used that second act to do the only thing he knew how to do: move cocaine. Some people can't be saved from themselves. Not because they don't understand the consequences, but because the consequences are less frightening than the alternative. And for George Jung, the alternative was being ordinary, being the kid from Weymouth, with nothing, being his father. That fear was stronger than any prison sentence. There is a scene near the end of the movie Blow that, if you've seen it, you haven't forgotten. An aging George Jung sits in a prison visiting room. The fluorescent lights hum overhead. He's older now, grayer. The swagger is gone. The confidence that once filled every room he walked into has been replaced by something quieter, something that looks a lot like regret. And he speaks. to his daughter, Christina. He tells her that he's sorry, that he missed it all. The birthdays, the school plays, the ordinary, irreplaceable moments that make up a childhood. He speaks with a tenderness that feels almost unbearable, coming from a man who once moved 85% of America's cocaine. And then the camera pulls back, and the chair across from him is empty. She never came. He's been talking to no one, imagining the visit he wanted, the reconciliation that existed only in his head. It is, without exaggeration, one of the most devastating scenes in modern cinema. Johnny Depp earned that moment. He'd prepared for it by spending time with the real George Jung in prison. He'd studied the man, learned his mannerisms, his way of speaking, the particular sadness that lives behind the eyes of someone who understands exactly what they've lost and knows they did it to themselves. Jung, for his part, was initially skeptical of the casting. His friend told him Depp had played a narc on 21 Jump Street and an androgynous barber in Edward Scissorhands. Jung reportedly thought, "This isn't going to work." He was wrong. Depp understood something about Jung that Jung himself might not have been able to articulate, that underneath the cocaine and the money and the lifestyle, there was a father, and that father had failed at the one job that actually mattered. But here's the thing about that scene, the one with the empty chair. It's a movie ending. It's designed to break your heart in exactly the right way, at exactly the right moment, so you leave the theater feeling something profound. And it works. It works beautifully. The real ending was worse. George Jung eventually got out of prison. He served his time. He was released. He was free. And the relationship with his daughter Christina never fully recovered. The movie gave you a fantasy of longing, a man separated from his daughter by concrete and barbed wire, imagining her visit, kept apart by the system. That's a story with a villain, the prison, the sentence. The system kept them apart. Reality didn't give Jung a villain. It gave him a mirror. Because when the gates opened and the concrete walls were behind him and nothing stood between George Jung and his daughter, except the accumulated weight of decades of absence, broken promises, and choices that said again and again that cocaine was more important than she was, the distance didn't close. Freedom doesn't fix what prison didn't cause. Walls don't create distance between a father and a daughter. Choices do. And Jung had made his choices. Every single day. For decades. The relationship with Christina was the thing the movie understood most clearly and depicted most honestly. It was the heart of the film. It was the story Ted Demme, the director, built everything around. And even with all the dramatic license that Hollywood takes, even with the compressed timelines and the simplified plot points, the emotional truth of that relationship was the one thing Blow got right. A man chose cocaine over his daughter, not once, not in one dramatic moment of weakness, but every day. For years, through every flight, every deal, every buried suitcase of cash. Every day he chose the trade was a day he chose not to be a father. And by the time he was ready to choose differently, the window had closed. George Jung died on May 5th, 2021. He was 78 years old. Liver, and kidney failure. The body gives out eventually, especially a body that spent decades processing the kind of substances that Jung both sold and consumed. He died free, which is more than most drug lords in this story can say. He wasn't shot on a rooftop like Escobar. He wasn't beaten to death in a prison cell like Bulger. He wasn't gunned down in a parking lot like Seal. He just faded, the way most people do, quietly, without headlines, without the dramatic ending that Hollywood would have written for him. In a way, that's the cruelest part. The movie gave him a poetic ending. The prison, the empty chair, the daughter who never came. It was devastating. But it was cinema. It had structure. It had meaning. It made the suffering feel purposeful. Real life doesn't work like that. Real life just ends. But he died carrying something that no amount of freedom could cure. The knowledge that the American dream he'd chased from that kitchen table in Weymouth, the dream that said money would fix everything, that wealth would erase the arguments, that being rich meant being free, was a lie. Not because the money didn't come. It came, mountains of it. More than his parents could have imagined in 100 lifetimes. The lie was that money was the problem in the first place. His parents weren't unhappy because they were poor. They were unhappy because they were unhappy. And George spent his entire life solving the wrong equation. He got the answer, and it didn't matter, because he'd been working on the wrong problem. Every drug lord in this story pays the same tax. Escobar's family became refugees. Bulger's brother's career was stained. Seal's children lost their father in a parking lot. And George Jung lost the one person who might have made all of it worth something. The family tax. It's the one bill the drug trade always collects, and no amount of cash stuffed in a wall can cover it. George Jung learned the cocaine business from one man. That man was a Beatles-loving neo-Nazi who turned a Caribbean island into a cocaine supermarket. And his story is next. There's a place in the Bahamas called Norman's Cay. If you've never heard of it, that's by design. And if you have heard of it, you probably heard the version that sounds like a fever dream. Because Norman's Cay is a small island in the Exuma chain, about 210 miles southeast of the coast of Florida. White sand beaches, crystal clear water, palm trees swaying in that particular Caribbean wind that makes everything feel slower than it actually is. In the late 1970s, it was a quiet place, a handful of vacation homes, a yacht club, a small marina where boaters would stop to refuel on their way through the Exumas. The kind of island that appears in travel brochures for people who want to feel like they've escaped the world. And then, Carlos Lehder arrived. Carlos Enrique Lehder Rivas was born in 1949 in Armenia, a city in the Colombian coffee region. His father was German, an immigrant who had come to Colombia after the Second World War. His mother was Colombian. He grew up between two cultures, spoke both languages, and possessed an ambition that neither culture could contain. As a young man, he drifted to the United States, got into trouble. Car theft, marijuana, The kind of low-level criminal activity that lands you in federal prison without making you famous. And it was in federal prison, at the correctional institution in Danbury, Connecticut, in 1974, that Carlos Lehder met a marijuana smuggler from Massachusetts named George Jung. We talked about Jung earlier. What matters here is what happened between those two men on a bunk bed in a federal prison cell. Jung taught Lehder about aviation-based smuggling. Lehder talked about Colombia and cocaine. Together, they sketched out a business plan that would change the world. But that part comes next. In 1978, Lehder began buying property on Norman's Cay. At first, the purchases seemed almost normal. A foreigner with money. Acquiring real estate in the Bahamas happens every day. But when certain property owners declined to sell, the situation changed. Pets were found dead. Vandalism, anonymous threats, boats tampered with. One resident reported waking to find his dock destroyed overnight. Others described armed men patrolling the roads. A yacht was discovered drifting offshore with a body aboard. The message was not subtle. Within months, most of the island's residents had left. The ones who stayed did so behind locked doors, and not for long. Lehder didn't just buy Norman's Cay, he took it, and then he built it into something the world had never seen. The airstrip was expanded to 3,300 feet, long enough to accommodate twin-engine cargo planes. Radar equipment was installed to monitor approaching aircraft, both friendly and otherwise. Armed guards with automatic weapons patrolled the perimeter. Doberman attack dogs roamed the island. The marina was brought under Lehder's control, which meant he controlled fuel access, which meant no one arrived or departed without his knowledge. At its peak, 300 kilograms of cocaine arrived on Norman's Cay every single day. Planes landed from Colombia, offloaded their cargo onto the island, and smaller aircraft ferried the product north to landing strips in Florida, Georgia, and the Carolinas. The operation ran like an airport, because that's exactly what it was. The Bahamian government, in theory, had jurisdiction. In practice, there were allegations that Lehder had bribed his way to the top. Lyndon Pindling, the Prime Minister of the Bahamas, was later the subject of a royal commission of inquiry that examined allegations of narcotics-related corruption. The commission found that Pindling had spent 8 times his official salary over a period of several years and could not adequately explain the source of the funds. Pindling denied any connection to drug traffickers. Meanwhile, off the coast of Norman's Cay, there is a sunken airplane, a Curtiss C-46 Commando, a twin-engine cargo plane from the Second World War era, resting in the shallow water just offshore. It crashed or was ditched during a drug-running flight that didn't quite make it. The plane sits there still, visible from the surface. The water is that clear. It's a monument to a flight that failed, and a reminder that hundreds of others succeeded. How does one person take over an entire island? In the Bahamas, a sovereign nation allied with the United Kingdom, and nobody stops him. The answer is the same answer that applies to every story in tonight's video. Money. Enough of it, applied in the right places, makes borders irrelevant and sovereignty negotiable. to understand what Carlos Lehder actually did, why his name belongs alongside Escobar and the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers in the history of the cocaine trade. You need to understand what the trade looked like before he arrived. Before Lehder, cocaine was smuggled into the United States the way you might imagine. Individual couriers, small quantities, a kilo hidden in a suitcase, a few kilos concealed in the false bottom of a car, maybe a fishing boat with a compartment below deck. The whole operation was retail level, artisanal, almost. One trip, one mule, one delivery. It was profitable, certainly, but it was also slow, inefficient, vulnerable. Every trip was a gamble. Every mule was a potential informant. Every border crossing was a coin flip. And the quantities were limited by the simple physics of what one person could carry without attracting attention. You could make money this way. You could live well. But you could not build an empire. You could not flood a continent. Carlos Lehder looked at this system and saw exactly what Henry Ford saw when he looked at the automobile workshops of the early 1900s. He saw inefficiency. He saw a product that everyone wanted, but that was being delivered through a system that couldn't scale. His innovation was simple in concept and staggering in execution. What he created was an air bridge, not one plane, not two planes. A fleet of small aircraft running continuous routes from Colombia to Norman's Cay to the southeastern United States. Each plane carried hundreds of kilograms per flight, multiple flights per day. The cocaine moved through Norman's Cay the way packages move through a distribution warehouse. It arrived in bulk. It was sorted and staged, and it was dispatched to its final destinations in smaller loads. This was not smuggling. This was logistics. This was supply chain management applied to cocaine. A federal prosecutor named Robert Merkel, the man who would eventually lead the case against Lehder, understood the significance immediately. He told the court and the press what Henry Ford was to automobiles, Lehder was to cocaine. That comparison is worth sitting with for a moment. Before Henry Ford, automobiles existed. They were expensive, hand-built, and available only to the wealthy. After Ford introduced the assembly line and the Model T, automobiles became mass-market products. The technology didn't change. The manufacturing process changed. And that process change transformed American society in ways that are still playing out a century later. Before Carlos Lehder, cocaine existed in the American market. It was expensive. It was available primarily in elite social circles, nightclubs, Hollywood parties, Wall Street offices. It was a drug for people who could afford to pay premium prices for small quantities, a luxury item, a status symbol. After Lehder, after the air bridge, after Norman's Cay, after the industrial-scale transport system he designed and operated, cocaine became cheap, abundant, available in every city, in every neighborhood, at price points that made it accessible to virtually anyone. The drug didn't change. The delivery system changed. And that change is what created the cocaine epidemic. Now, in the history of the drug trade, people argue about who bears the most responsibility for what cocaine did to the United States and to Colombia. Pablo Escobar is the name everyone knows. He produced the cocaine. He built the Medellin cartel. He accumulated $30 billion. He appeared on the Forbes list. He is, by any measure, the most famous drug lord in history. George Young is the name Hollywood gave us. Johnny Depp played him in Blow. He distributed cocaine on the American end. He was the face of the California and Massachusetts markets. But Carlos Lehder is the one who connected production to distribution at scale. Without Lehder's transport infrastructure, Escobar's cocaine stays in Colombia. Without the air bridge, Young's distribution network has nothing to distribute. Lehder was the pipeline, the bridge between supply and demand. The reason cocaine stopped being an elite novelty and became a national crisis. Henry Ford didn't invent the automobile. He made it available to everyone. Carlos Lehder didn't invent cocaine trafficking. He made it available to the world, and the world was never the same. The movie Blow, released in 2001 with Johnny Depp as George Young, showed portions of this story. It showed the partnership. It showed some of the early flights. But the film was Young's story, not Lehder's. And because it was Young's story, the focus was on the human drama, the broken family, the prison time, the wasted potential. What got lost was the systemic impact. What got lost was the fact that Carlos Lehder didn't just make money. He created a model, a template, a proof of concept that every drug trafficking organization in the Western Hemisphere would study and replicate for decades. The Henry Ford comparison isn't hyperbole. It's the most precise description available for what Carlos Lehder did to the cocaine trade. There's a detail about Carlos Lehder that I've been holding back, because it's the kind of detail that, if I told you too early, you might not believe the rest of the story. You'd think I was making it up. You'd think this was the fiction part of tonight's Fact and Fiction tour. But this is documented. Court testimony, witness statements, newspaper archives, photographs. Carlos Lehder, the Henry Ford of cocaine, the man who industrialized the drug trade, the architect of Norman's Cay, was obsessed with two people, John Lennon and Adolf Hitler, both of them at the same time. He played Lennon's music constantly on Norman's Cay. Imagine drifting across the white sand while armed guards with automatic weapons patrolled the tree line. He quoted Lennon's lyrics in conversation. He spoke about peace and love and the brotherhood of all people with what associates described as genuine conviction. He believed in Lennon's vision, or at least he believed in it. He also dressed in military fatigues. He praised the Nazi regime. He spoke about the superiority of certain races. He railed against Jewish people with the kind of focused, vitriolic hatred that goes beyond casual prejudice into the territory of genuine ideological commitment. He compared himself to Hitler, not as a joke, not as provocation, as a serious self-assessment. On Norman's Cay, he built what amounted to a neo-Nazi paramilitary compound. The armed guards weren't just protecting cocaine. They were foot soldiers in Lehder's personal militia, an organization that blended drug trade security with fascist ideology in ways that made no coherent sense to anyone, except, presumably, Carlos Lehder himself. He founded a political party in Colombia called the Movimiento Latino Nacional. He bought a newspaper to spread his views. He hosted political rallies where he advocated for the legalization of marijuana while simultaneously running the largest illegal cocaine transport operation in the Western Hemisphere. The rallies featured Nazi-inspired imagery alongside populist rhetoric about Colombian sovereignty and resistance to American imperialism. John Lennon and Adolf Hitler. Imagine all the people living in a fascist drug state. Let that contradiction marinate. Because here's the thing. In the drug trade, you encounter plenty of violent men, plenty of ruthless men, plenty of men whose moral compass has been demagnetized by money and power. But Carlos Lehder wasn't just immoral. He was paradoxical. He held two sets of beliefs that cannot coexist in a functioning mind. Peace and fascism, love and racial hatred, Lenin and Hitler. And he appeared to see no contradiction whatsoever. Prosecutors who dealt with him described a man of genuine intelligence and considerable charisma. Associates described someone who could be generous, even sentimental, one moment, and terrifyingly cold the next. The cocaine he consumed in enormous quantities may explain some of the erratic behavior. But cocaine doesn't create ideology. It doesn't plant Hitler in a brain that was listening to Give Peace a Chance. That was already there, somehow. Alongside the Lennon records and the Caribbean sunsets and the white sand beaches, the human mind can hold contradictions that logic cannot resolve. Carlos Lehder is the proof. And in a strange way, the absurdity of it all serves a purpose in tonight's story. Because we've been in dark territory for a while now. Torture rooms, billion-dollar body counts, government complicity. The drug trade is relentless in its grimness. And then you encounter Carlos Lehder, dressed in Nazi regalia on a tropical island, blasting Imagine through loudspeakers while 300 kilos of cocaine gets sorted on the tarmac. And the sheer absurdity of it breaks something open. Not because it's funny. It is funny in a way, but more because it reminds you that the people at the center of these stories are not the cool, composed figures that Hollywood presents. They are, very often, deeply strange, contradictory, human in the messiest, most confounding sense of the word. The drug trade doesn't attract philosopher kings. It attracts men like Carlos Lehder, men who can build a billion-dollar transport empire and a neo-Nazi paramilitary force while listening to All You Need Is Love. The world is stranger than the movies. Always. Narcos on Netflix portrayed Lehder across several episodes. They showed the ambition, the megalomania, some of the Norman's K operation. But they softened the Nazi element. Understandably. Because how do you put that on a screen and have the audience believe it? How do you show a man who is simultaneously quoting Imagine and praising the Third Reich without the audience assuming you've lost the plot? You can't. So the show dialed it back. The reality was louder, stranger, more unsettling, and ultimately more human in the way that only real human beings can be unsettling. Every drug lord in Colombia feared one thing above all others. Not the police, not the military, not rival cartels. They feared extradition. Being sent to the United States, where Colombian money couldn't buy Colombian judges, where the legal system didn't operate on bribes, and where a life sentence meant a life sentence. Pablo Escobar offered to pay off Colombia's entire national debt to prevent extradition. He bombed airplanes. He assassinated judges. He waged a campaign of terror against the Colombian state that killed thousands of people, all to avoid being put on a plane to the United States. Carlos Lehder was the first major Colombian drug trafficker to be extradited to the United States for prosecution. The precedent, the proof of concept, the test case that every subsequent extradition would be measured against. It started with betrayal. George Jung, Lehder's former bunkmate, his original partner, the man who'd taught him everything about aviation smuggling, was arrested and facing decades in prison. Jung made a choice. He cooperated with federal prosecutors, and the testimony he provided about Lehder's operations, about Norman's Cay, about the scale and method of the air bridge, was devastating. Jung wasn't the only cooperating witness, but his testimony carried particular weight because he'd been there from the beginning. He could trace the entire arc from the bunk bed in Danbury to the airstrip on Norman's Cay. He could describe what he'd seen, what he'd done, and what Lehder had built after pushing him aside. He could explain the air bridge not as an abstraction, but as a lived experience, because he'd helped invent it. There's a dark poetry in that. The man who taught Lehder how to fly drugs across borders became the man who grounded him forever, or so it seemed at the time. Lehder was captured in Colombia in February 1987. The Colombian government, under enormous pressure from the United States, agreed to the extradition. Lehder was put on a plane and flown to Jacksonville, Florida, to stand trial. The trial was a spectacle. Federal prosecutors presented evidence of a cocaine trafficking operation so vast that jurors visibly struggled to comprehend the numbers. 300 kilograms a day, hundreds of flights, billions of dollars, an entire island converted into a drug transshipment hub. The scope was not just criminal, it was geopolitical. One man had operated a sovereign drug state within the territorial waters of a Commonwealth nation, with the alleged complicity of that nation's government. Lehder's defense attempted various strategies. His attorneys argued that the evidence was tainted, that cooperating witnesses were unreliable, that the government had overstated the scale. But the physical evidence, the radar installations, the expanded airstrip, the sunken plane offshore, the testimony of residents who'd been terrorized into leaving their homes, painted a picture that was difficult to dismiss. On May 19th, 1987, Carlos Lehder was found guilty. The sentence: life in prison without the possibility of parole, plus 135 years. Life plus 135 years. As if life alone wasn't sufficient. As if the court wanted to ensure that even in the afterlife, Carlos Lehder would still be serving time. The sentence sent a message to every drug trafficker in Colombia. Extradition was real. The United States would reach across borders, across oceans, across sovereign governments. And it would not be gentle when it got there. Life plus 135 years was not a punishment calibrated to one man's crimes. It was a deterrent aimed at an entire industry. But the story doesn't end there. Because the American justice system, for all its severity, has one mechanism that can override even the most draconian sentence: cooperation. In the early 1990s, the United States was building a case against Manuel Noriega, the former dictator of Panama, who had been captured during the 1989 American invasion. Noriega's connections to the drug trade were extensive, and prosecutors needed witnesses who could testify to the specifics. Carlos Lehder, sitting in a federal prison with nothing ahead of him but concrete walls until the end of time, offered to cooperate. His testimony against Noriega was detailed and damaging. He described financial arrangements, logistics, the use of Panamanian territory, and banking systems for drug trade purposes. He spoke about meetings, about payments, about the way Noriega's Panama served as a way station for cocaine and a laundromat for drug money. Whether his testimony was entirely truthful or partly self-serving. Whether a man serving life plus 135 years might be inclined to say whatever prosecutors wanted to hear is a question that defense attorneys raised forcefully and that has never been fully resolved. What matters is that the government found it valuable enough to reduce his sentence significantly. In June 2020, after 33 years in American federal custody, Carlos Lehder was quietly released from prison. He was 71 years old. He was not returned to Colombia. He was deported to Germany, where he holds citizenship through his German father. The Henry Ford of cocaine. The John Lennon fanatic who dressed like Hitler. The man who took over a Bahamian island and turned it into the most efficient drug distribution hub in the Western Hemisphere. The first major Colombian trafficker extradited to the United States, sentenced to life plus 135 years. Free in Germany after 33 years. The system that extradited him, convicted him, and sentenced him to die in prison, eventually decided he was more useful as a witness than as a prisoner, and so the door opened. The way it always does when utility outweighs principle. Norman's Cay is quiet again now. The airstrip is overgrown. The radar installations are gone. The armed guards and Dobermans are decades in the past. Tourists visit sometimes. They snorkel over the sunken C-46 cargo plane in the shallows, taking photographs of the wreckage through crystal-clear water. Most of them have no idea what the plane was carrying when it went down. Most of them have never heard the name Carlos Lehder. The island forgot him. The way islands do, sand covers everything eventually. But the infrastructure he built, the air bridge, the concept of industrial-scale cocaine transport, the proof that you could move product, not in kilos, but in tons. That infrastructure didn't disappear when Lehder went to prison. It was adopted, improved, scaled further. Every drug trafficking organization that came after him inherited the basic template that Carlos Lehder invented on a small island in the Bahamas. Henry Ford's assembly line outlived Henry Ford. Carlos Lehder's air bridge outlived Carlos Lehder. The innovation persists long after the innovator is forgotten. Lehder revolutionized the supply side. He solved the problem of getting cocaine from Colombia to America in quantities that could satisfy a continent's appetite. But in Harlem, another man was building a legend on the demand side. A legend built almost entirely on lies. And when Hollywood came calling, the lies became a $266 million movie that most people still believe is true. Frank Lucas was born on September 9th, 1930, in LaGrange, North Carolina. A small town, a quiet town, The kind of place where the road out matters more than anything that happens while you're there. By the late 1940s, Lucas had taken that road, headed north. Destination? Harlem, New York City, the center of Black American ambition, art, and, if you knew the right people, organized crime. Harlem in the late 40s was a place of contradictions, jazz clubs and junkies, church on Sunday, and numbers running on Monday. Legitimate businesses operating alongside operations that were anything but. And the man who sat at the intersection of it all, the man who held the neighborhood together through a combination of charm, muscle, and old-school diplomacy, was Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Lucas arrived as a young man with very little money and very large plans, and according to him, according to the story he spent decades telling, Bumpy Johnson took him under his wing almost immediately. Lucas described it as a mentorship, a fatherly bond, the aging boss and the hungry protege walking the streets of Harlem together, discussing business philosophy and power dynamics over dinner. He said Bumpy taught him everything: how to run a crew, how to manage money, how to command respect without raising your voice. It's a wonderful story, cinematic even. Ridley Scott certainly thought so. But Bumpy Johnson's widow, Mamie Johnson, saw it differently, quite differently. She said her husband distrusted Lucas, that he was never more than a flunky, a runner, an errand boy, the kind of low-level associate you send for coffee, not the kind you share strategy with. Her account paints a picture, not of a protege being groomed for greatness, but of a minor figure who later inflated his own importance after the only man who could contradict him was dead. Now, disputed origin story aside, what Frank Lucas actually did in the heroin business was genuinely innovative, and it's worth understanding because the innovation is what made him rich, and the mythology is what made him famous. Those are two very different achievements. Lucas's insight was simple, deceptively simple, the kind of simple that looks obvious after someone does it and impossible before. Eliminate the middlemen. At the time, the heroin supply chain running into Harlem passed through multiple hands. Italian organized crime families who controlled the import pipeline, wholesale distributors who broke bulk into smaller packages, street-level brokers who marked it up one final time before it reached the consumer. Each layer took a cut. Each layer diluted the product. By the time a bag of heroin reached a buyer on a Harlem street corner, it had been stepped on so many times, cut with quinine, lactose, whatever was cheap and white and powdery, that the original product was barely recognizable, and the profit margin for any single operator was a fraction of what it could be. Lucas went directly to the source. The Golden Triangle, that intersection of Myanmar, Laos, and Thailand in Southeast Asia, where the majority of the world's opium was produced. He established contacts with suppliers in the region and arranged to purchase heroin at origin prices, cutting out every intermediary between the poppy fields and 116th Street. The product he brought back was branded Blue Magic, 98% pure. In a market where most heroin had been stepped on so many times it was barely 50%, Blue Magic was a revelation. Users knew the name, dealers knew the name, and Frank Lucas The man behind the name was reportedly generating $1 million per day at his peak. $1 million per day. Think about that for a moment. Not $1 million a year, not $1 million over the course of a career. $1 million flowing through a single operation every 24 hours in 1970s money. Adjusted for inflation, you're looking at something north of 7 million in today's terms every single day, 7 days a week, while the rest of Harlem was scraping by. But here's what the movie doesn't spend much time on. The man who actually organized the Southeast Asian supply chain. The man who built the logistics, cultivated the relationships, and solved the impossible problem of moving product from rural Thailand to urban America was not Frank Lucas. It was Leslie Ike Atkinson, a quiet, methodical military man married to one of Lucas's relatives who had spent years stationed in Bangkok and understood the region's smuggling infrastructure with a level of operational detail that Lucas simply didn't possess. Atkinson knew the suppliers. Atkinson knew the routes. Atkinson knew which officials could be paid, which customs checkpoints could be avoided, and which shipping methods would survive the 17,000-mile journey from Southeast Asia to the eastern seaboard without detection. He was the architect. Lucas was the brand. And in the drug business, same as any other business, the brand gets the credit. Remember that distinction. The architect versus the brand. It matters in a moment. It matters quite a lot, actually. There is a scene in American Gangster that if you've seen the film, you remember. You remember it because Ridley Scott wanted you to remember it. He shot it to be unforgettable. Denzel Washington stands on a military airfield. The light is gray, solemn. A cargo plane has landed, and from its belly, flag-draped coffins are being unloaded. The coffins of American dyers killed in Vietnam, men who gave their lives in service. And inside those coffins, hidden beneath the bodies of the dead, are bricks of heroin. Frank Lucas's heroin, blue magic, smuggled into the United States inside the caskets of fallen servicemen. It is one of the most powerful images in modern crime cinema. The audacity of it, the sacrilege, the sheer cold-blooded genius of using dead American soldiers as drug mules. Mothers are waiting at home for those coffins. Families are preparing funerals. And Frank Lucas has turned their grief into a logistics solution. It tells you everything you need to know about the character in a single, wordless shot. The man will cross any line, disrespect any boundary, use any vehicle, even the honored dead, to move his product. Except it never happened. Not once. Not in any form. Not in a coffin. Not in a casket. Not in a body bag. There is zero physical evidence. Zero corroborating testimony. Zero DEA records, and zero military documentation supporting the claim that Frank Lucas ever smuggled heroin inside the coffins of dead American soldiers. Zero. Leslie Atkinson, the man who actually built and operated the smuggling network, called the coffin story the biggest hoax ever perpetrated. And Atkinson would know. He was there. He organized the logistics. He solved the actual, real-world problem of moving heroin from Southeast Asia to the United States. So what did happen? What happened was furniture. Teak furniture specifically. Hollowed-out teak furniture built in workshops in Bangkok, designed with hidden compartments large enough to conceal significant quantities of product. The furniture was shipped through military postal channels, a system that, at the time, received minimal customs inspection because it was considered a morale-boosting service for soldiers sending gifts home to their families. That's the real story. Hollowed-out furniture, shipped through the mail system. Clever, certainly. Effective, absolutely. But it lacks cinematic grandeur. It's hard to build $100 million movie around a hollowed-out teak coffee table. Now, here's where the coffin myth originated, and this part is almost funny in its simplicity. Atkinson's furniture was built in a workshop that also made coffins. A coffin shop. When Lucas described the operation, when he was telling his story years later to journalists and filmmakers and anyone who would listen, he mentioned that the drugs came from a coffin shop. And somewhere between the truth and the telling, shipped from a coffin shop became shipped inside coffins. A detail about the manufacturing location became a detail about the smuggling method, and Frank Lucas, who understood the power of a good story better than most novelists, did not correct the error. He leaned into it hard. He built on it. He added details. He described the weight of the coffins. He talked about the logistics of loading and unloading. He made it vivid, specific, tangible, the way a great liar always does, because specificity is what makes fiction feel like memory. The coffin story became central to his legend. It was the detail that made people lean forward. The detail that made journalists call back. The detail that, eventually, made Ridley Scott write a check. Biographer Ron Chepesiuk investigated the coffin claim extensively. He found nothing. No evidence. No witnesses. No paper trail. No retired military personnel saying, "Yes, I saw that." No customs records indicating flagged coffins. No DEA intelligence suggesting the method was ever used. Nothing. So let me make sure we're all in the same place. The most iconic scene in one of the most celebrated crime films of the 2000s. A scene directed by Ridley Scott, performed by Denzel Washington, produced for $100 million, and watched by tens of millions of people, was based on a lie. A lie told by a drug dealer to make himself sound more impressive. And the production company that spent $100 million making that movie did not check. Wait, what? They didn't check. Or they checked and didn't care. Or they checked and decided the myth was better than the truth. In any case, the result is the same. The coffin scene is fiction, presented as fact. And because it's Ridley Scott and Denzel Washington, because the filmmaking is superb, because the image is so powerful and so emotionally loaded, millions of people believe it happened. That's the thing about a great movie. A great movie doesn't just tell a story, it replaces reality. And once reality has been replaced, the replacement becomes the only version anyone remembers. Somewhere, Leslie Ike Atkinson watched that scene in a theater. The man who actually built the smuggling operation. The man who actually solved the logistics. The man whose teak furniture scheme was the real innovation. And he watched Denzel Washington take credit for something that never happened. inside coffins that were never used, on an airfield that exists only in a screenwriter's imagination. I wonder what that felt like. Here's the interesting thing about the coffin lie. It wasn't an anomaly, it was a pattern. Go back to the Bumpy Johnson claim. Lucas spent years telling anyone who would listen that he was Bumpy's right hand, his protege, his chosen successor. And Mamie Johnson, Bumpy's own widow, the woman who shared his bed and his secrets and his dinner table for AIDS, said it wasn't true. Multiple sources from that era corroborate her account. Lucas was around. Lucas ran errands, but protege is a generous word for what he was. Then there's the matter of Richie Roberts. Russell Crowe played Roberts in American Gangster as the dogged, incorruptible detective who brought Lucas down. It makes for excellent cinema. The cop and the criminal. The chess match. Two titans locked in a battle of wits across the Harlem skyline. Roberts himself has disputed many aspects of the film. The investigation wasn't the singular, obsessive pursuit the movie depicts. It was a sprawling, multi-agency effort involving dozens of agents, competing jurisdictions, paperwork that could fill a shipping container, and the kind of interagency politics that make for terrible cinema, but accurate policing. The implication being that the adversarial relationship portrayed on screen was simplified, dramatized, shaped to fit the mold of a Hollywood cat-and-mouse thriller rather than the messier, more bureaucratic, less cinematic reality of how drug investigations actually work. So, you have the Bumpy Johnson mentorship disputed, the coffin smuggling method fabricated, the Roberts rivalry dramatized, the revenue claims unverified, pattern upon pattern upon pattern. And here's my read on it. Take it or leave it. You might disagree. I think Frank Lucas understood something that most criminals don't. He understood that the legend is worth more than the crime, that in America, mythology is a commodity, and that if you build the right myth, if you tell the right story with the right details, at the right moment, the myth takes on a life of its own. It becomes self-sustaining. It attracts journalists, then authors, then screenwriters, then directors, then Denzel Washington. And once Denzel Washington is you on screen, the myth is no longer a myth. It's history. You don't need to actually smuggle heroin in coffins. You just need people to believe you did. Because the legend gets you the movie deal. This is what I call the mythology machine, and Hollywood is its most powerful engine. See, Hollywood didn't create the Frank Lucas myth from nothing. Lucas built the foundation. He told the stories, cultivated the image, constructed the narrative. He was, in a very real sense, his own publicist. But Hollywood took that foundation and built a cathedral on top of it. Ridley Scott's direction, Denzel's performance, the sweeping cinematography, the Oscar-caliber production, all of it served to amplify a mythology that was already, at its core, fabricated. And here's the part that should bother you. American Gangster didn't just amplify the myth. It made the myth permanent. Before the film, the coffin story was an old street legend, the kind of thing that floated around Harlem barbershops and drug war memoirs. Interesting if true. After the film, it's embedded in popular culture. It's what people know about Frank Lucas. Ask anyone who's seen American Gangster what they remember, and they'll tell you about the coffins, not The teak furniture? Not Ike Atkinson. Not the real supply chain. The coffins. That's the power of cinema. A lie told well enough, with enough production value, becomes indistinguishable from the truth. And once it's in the culture, you can't extract it. You can publish corrections. You can cite biographers. You can interview Atkinson himself. Doesn't matter. The image of Denzel Washington standing on that airfield is stronger than any fact. Frank Lucas knew that instinctively. He may not have known anything about film production or narrative structure or visual storytelling, but he knew that a great story, told with enough confidence, becomes the only version that matters. The truth is just a competing draft, and competing drafts don't sell tickets. You know what sells tickets? Coffins on an airfield. Denzel in a fur coat, a man who looked at the Vietnam War and saw a shipping opportunity. That sells tickets. The truth. The teak furniture. The quiet logistics man. The mundane reality of postal fraud. That goes in the footnotes, if it goes anywhere at all. In 1976, the mythology ran into the legal system. And the legal system, it turns out, doesn't care about your legend. It cares about evidence. And there was plenty. Frank Lucas was arrested and convicted of federal drug trafficking charges. The sentence, 70 years? The kind of number that isn't really a sentence at all. It's a statement. You are going to die a federal facility. The government doesn't want your reform. It wants your disappearance. 70 years. He was 46 years old. Do the math. He would have been released, theoretically, at the age of 116. The sentence wasn't a prison term, it was a life sentence with extra decades stapled on for emphasis. Now, Frank Lucas had spent his career building a reputation on loyalty. Loyalty to Bumpy Johnson, real or imagined. Loyalty to his family, whom he employed throughout his operation. Loyalty to Harlem, which he claimed to love even as he flooded its streets with heroin so pure it was killing addicts who couldn't gauge the dosage. Loyalty was central to the Lucas brand. It was part of the myth. The man who never turned. The man who stood tall. So naturally, he turned. Lucas became a federal informant. He provided the government with names, routes, supplier identities, distribution networks, and operational details that led to the prosecution of dozens of drug figures. His cooperation was extensive, thorough, the kind of cooperation that suggests a man who had been keeping mental notes his entire career, just in case this moment arrived. In exchange, his sentence was reduced dramatically. His family was placed in the Witness Protection Program. Frank Lucas, the man who built his legend on loyalty, earned his freedom by becoming the thing the streets despise most. An informant, a snitch, a rat. Whatever word the streets use in whatever decade you're listening. There's no judgment in that observation. Everyone has the right to save their own life. 70 years is 70 years. But there is an irony so thick, you could lay bricks on it. The man whose entire mythology was built on honor, on codes, on Bumpy Johnson's old world principles, negotiated his way out by selling everyone he knew. And then he sold the story to Hollywood. Because why not? He'd sold everything else. In 2007, Ridley Scott's American Gangster arrived in theaters. Denzel Washington's performance was magnetic. He played Lucas with a quiet, terrifying dignity. A man who controlled rooms without raising his voice, who dressed in understated elegance while his competitors wore fur coats and jewelry. It was a masterclass in screen presence. Washington made you understand why men followed Frank Lucas, why they feared him, why they respected him. The performance served two purposes simultaneously. It served Hollywood, which got its anti-hero, its prestige crime drama, its Oscar vehicle, and it served Frank Lucas, who got the one thing every myth-maker craves: canonization. Denzel Washington didn't just play Frank Lucas. He became the definitive version. The version people remember. The version that replaced the actual man in the public consciousness. The actual man was 5'8". The actual man got caught. The actual man became an informant. The actual man lied about coffins. But on screen, the actual man doesn't exist. On screen, there is only Denzel. Calm, lethal, brilliant, walking through Harlem like he owns it. Because in the film, he does. And that's the final trick. The ultimate con. Frank Lucas didn't just lie to journalists and filmmakers. Through Hollywood, he lied to the world. And the world believed him because Denzel Washington is a very convincing man. Frank Lucas died on May 30th, 2019. He was 88 years old. He had outlived most of his associates, most of his enemies, and most of the people who could contradict his stories. He died in a wheelchair in Newark, New Jersey, far from the Harlem streets where he'd built his empire, and even further from the North Carolina backroads where he'd started. By the time he passed, the movie was 12 years old, and an entire generation knew his name only through Denzel's face. The myth had won, completely, permanently. So what's the assessment? Was Frank Lucas a successful drug lord? Yes. He ran a genuinely profitable heroin operation during a period when Harlem's drug market was wide open. He made real money. He moved real product. He employed real people. That's not in dispute. Was he the most innovative smuggler in history? Not even close. The innovation belonged to Ike Atkinson, who built the supply chain. The branding belonged to Lucas, who sold the product. And the mythology belonged to Lucas alone, who told the stories, embellished the details, and understood that in America, the story of what you did matters more than what you actually did. Was he the legend that American Gangster portrayed? No. He was a successful regional drug trafficker who happened to be an extraordinary liar. And he found, in Hollywood, a system perfectly designed to reward extraordinary liars with extraordinary production budgets. A system that doesn't ask, is this true? But rather, will this sell? And Frank Lucas's story, the version he told, not the version that happened, sold beautifully. That's Frank Lucas, a man who turned fabrication into a filmography, a man who understood that the gap between reality and myth isn't a problem to be solved. It's a business opportunity. He ran 2 operations in his lifetime. The first was heroin. The second was his own reputation. And the second one was far more successful than the first. Ike Atkinson, by the way, received no movie deal. No Denzel, no Ridley Scott. He served his time and disappeared into the kind of obscurity that awaits people who do the actual work while someone else takes the credit. The architect, forgotten. The brand, immortalized. Frank Lucas built his legend on lies. But the man in our final story, his truth is more devastating than any movie Hollywood could make. Ricky Donald Ross was born on January 26, 1960, in Tyler, Texas, a small East Texas town. The kind of place where ambition either carries you out or settles you in. For Ricky, the journey out came early. His family moved to South Central Los Angeles when he was still young, trading one form of poverty for another, but at least this version came with paved roads and public schools. And those public schools are where this story actually begins. Not in the drug trade, not on the streets, in a classroom. See, Ricky Ross was a talented athlete, tennis specifically. And I know that doesn't fit the image you're building in your head right now, so let me adjust it for you. This wasn't recreational tennis. This wasn't weekend tennis. Ricky Ross picked up a racket and discovered he had something most people never find: a natural, almost mechanical gift. His hand-eye coordination was exceptional. His footwork was instinctive. He moved around the court like someone who had been doing it for years, except he hadn't. He was just built for it. Good enough to be scouted for a college scholarship. In South Central LA in the 1970s, that's not just talent. That's a lifeline. That's the difference between a trajectory and a dead end. A tennis scholarship doesn't just pay for school. It pays for escape. It buys you 4 years in a different world, with different rules, different expectations, and different outcomes. For a kid in South Central, that scholarship application might as well have been a passport. But there was a problem so fundamental, so quietly catastrophic, that it makes everything that follows feel less like a choice and more like a verdict. Ricky Ross could not read. He was functionally illiterate, not struggling, not behind grade level. He could not read the college application, the document that represented his only legitimate path out of South Central, and he couldn't decode the words on the page. 18 years old, a gifted athlete, and the school system that had passed him from grade to grade, year after year, had never taught him to read. Now, I want you to sit with that for a moment. Because what happened next? The drug empire, the millions, the destruction. None of it is comprehensible without understanding this single fact. The system didn't fail Ricky Ross by accident. It failed him by design, or rather, by indifference, which in practice amounts to the same thing. A black kid in South Central in the 1970s who couldn't read wasn't a crisis. He was a statistic. Nobody raised an alarm. Nobody intervened. Nobody looked at a clearly intelligent young man who happened to be illiterate and asked the obvious question: how did we let this happen? They just moved him along, and when the legitimate path closed, he found another one. Within a few years, Ricky Ross wasn't just selling cocaine. He was distributing it at scale. The kind of scale that makes business school case studies look quaint. At his peak, he was moving $3 million worth of cocaine per day. Not per month, per day. His network stretched across 42 cities in the United States. Gross revenue estimates run as high as $900 million. profit, roughly 300 million. His nickname, Freeway, didn't come from the speed of his operation, though that would have been appropriate. It came from the properties he owned along Los Angeles' Interstate 110, the Harbor Freeway. Real estate acquired with drug money named after the concrete artery that ran through his territory. He couldn't read, but he understood the economics of distribution better than anyone with an MBA. He understood supply chains, pricing psychology, territory management, and competitive dynamics with an intuitive precision that would have made him extraordinarily successful in any legitimate industry. The same mind that built a 42-city narcotics network could have built a retail empire, or a logistics company, or a franchise operation. But nobody taught him to read, so he built something else. The system produces its own enemy. That's not philosophy, that's just arithmetic. You take a sharp mind, deny it every legitimate tool, and then act surprised when it finds illegitimate ones. Ricky Ross didn't choose the drug trade the way a person chooses a career. He fell into the only door that was open, and then he turned out to be better at it than almost anyone in history. Which brings us to the question that nobody in law enforcement, nobody in the court system, nobody in the Reagan administration's war on drugs ever wanted to ask. Where was he getting the cocaine? The answer to that question is the most dangerous sentence in the history of American drug enforcement. Rick Ross's primary cocaine supplier was a man named Oscar Danilo Blandon Reyes, a Nicaraguan exile. Educated, politically connected, and deeply embedded in the anti-Sandinista movement that the United States was funding through every available channel, and several channels that was specifically not available because Congress had explicitly prohibited them. Blandon wasn't a street dealer. He wasn't a cartel lieutenant in the traditional sense. He was something far more complicated. He was connected to the Contras, the Nicaraguan rebel group that the Reagan administration supported, with the kind of fervor usually reserved for existential threats. And the Contras, in turn, were connected to the Central Intelligence Agency through the Iran-Contra affair, the most significant covert operations scandal of the 20th century. This is where the story stops being about one man's drug empire and starts being about something much larger. Something the United States government has spent decades trying to keep quiet. In 1996, a journalist named Gary Webb published a series of articles in the San Jose Mercury News called Dark Alliance. The series was meticulously researched. It traced the cocaine supply chain from Nicaraguan Contra-connected suppliers through men like Blandon, directly into communities like South Central Los Angeles. The explosive claim, supported by court records, testimony, and documented evidence, was this: the CIA had facilitated, or at minimum, turned a deliberate blind eye to, cocaine trafficking by individuals connected to the Contra war effort. The cocaine that flooded South Central LA. The cocaine that Rick Ross distributed across 42 American cities had traveled a supply chain that ran through a CIA-backed operation. Let me say that differently, so there's no ambiguity. The United States government's own intelligence agency enabled the supply chain that destroyed black communities across America. Not through incompetence, through policy. Now, the CIA denied it. They denied it loudly, repeatedly, and with the full institutional weight of the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth. Major newspapers: the LA Times, the Washington Post, the New York Times, ran their own investigations and challenged Webb's conclusions. The pushback was fierce and coordinated. But here's what the pushback couldn't erase. In 1989, 7 years before Webb published his series, a Senate investigation, led by Senator John Kerry, had already examined these connections. The Kerry Committee report found that members of the U.S. State Department had provided support to known drug traffickers. It found that Contra supporters were directly involved in drug trafficking, and it found that United States agencies had information about these activities and did not act on it. The Senate of the United States investigated this and confirmed it. In 1989, then, in 1998, the CIA conducted its own internal investigation. The resulting report, authored by Inspector General Frederick Hitz, admitted that the agency was aware of Contra drug trafficking. It admitted that in some cases, the CIA had actively discouraged the DEA and other agencies from investigating Contra-connected drug operations. Not passively, actively. The agency intervened to prevent investigations into its own assets, drug trafficking. The CIA's own report confirmed what Webb had written, what the Kerry Committee had found, what the evidence had been screaming for a decade. But by then, it didn't matter, because the messenger had already been destroyed. What Rick Ross unleashed, with cocaine supplied through a pipeline the CIA knew about and protected, was one of the most devastating public health catastrophes in American history. The crack cocaine epidemic. See, the economics are almost elegant in their brutality. Powder cocaine was expensive, a rich person's drug. A gram cost $100 or more, but cook that same powder into crack. A simple chemical process involving baking soda and heat. And suddenly, you could sell individual rocks for $5 or $10. The product was the same molecule. The high was shorter, but more intense. And the price point opened the market to communities that powder cocaine had never reached. Communities like South Central LA, like Compton, like Watts, like every under-resourced, over-policed neighborhood in America where people were looking for something, anything, to dull the edges of a life the system had already decided wasn't worth investing in. Rick Ross didn't invent crack cocaine, but his distribution network, stretching across 42 cities, operating with the efficiency of a Fortune 500 supply chain, made him one of the most significant figures in its proliferation. The product moved from South Central outward, following interstate highways and bus routes and family connections, until it reached cities that had never seen it before. The devastation was total. And I don't use that word casually. Total. Families destroyed, children orphaned or raised by grandparents, while their parents disappeared into addiction or prison, or both. Entire neighborhoods, hollowed out, block by block, street by street. The buildings were still standing, but the communities inside them were gone. Replaced by addiction, by violence, by the slow corrosion of trust that happens when everyone you know is either using, selling, or locked up. Life expectancy dropped. Murder rates quadrupled in some neighborhoods. Emergency rooms were overwhelmed. Foster care systems buckled under the weight of children who had nowhere else to go. The social fabric of Black America, already strained by decades of redlining, underfunding, and systematic neglect, ripped apart at the seams. And it happened fast. Within 2 or 3 years, neighborhoods that had been struggling but intact became war zones. And then came the policy response. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 established a sentencing disparity that has been called one of the most racially discriminatory policies in modern American history. 5 grams of crack cocaine, the form used predominantly in black communities, carried the same mandatory minimum sentence as 500 grams of powder cocaine, the form used predominantly in white communities. The same molecule, the same drug, 100-to-1 sentencing ratio. The result was mass incarceration on a scale the country had never seen. Now, think about the supply chain for a moment. We've traced it across this entire documentary. Carlos Lehder provided the transportation infrastructure, the Norman's Cay operation that turned the Bahamas into a refueling station. Pablo Escobar's Medellin cartel produced the product at industrial scale. The CIA-connected pipeline delivered it into the United States through Contra-affiliated suppliers. And Rick Ross provided the last-mile delivery, the distribution network that put it on the streets of 42 American cities. From a Colombian jungle lab to a CIA-protected supply line to the streets of South Central, to a $5 rock of crack cocaine in a glass pipe. That's the chain. That's how it worked. And every link in that chain had a government partner standing right next to it. So, here's the question I want you to carry with you. Not whether Rick Ross was guilty. He was. He has said so himself. He built the network. He moved the product. He profited enormously from the suffering of his own community. The question is whether the system that failed to teach him to read then enabled his cocaine supply through a CIA-protected operation, then sentenced him to life in prison for the result, was guilty too. And if so, who served that sentence? You already know the answer. In 1996, Rick Ross was arrested in a DEA sting operation. He attempted to purchase 100 kilograms of cocaine from a federal agent. The conviction triggered California's 3 strikes law. The sentence, life in prison. No possibility of parole. Life for a man who couldn't read when he entered the drug trade, who was supplied by a man connected to the CIA, whose entire operation existed within a supply chain that the United States government knew about and chose not to disrupt. Now, let me tell you what happened to the people on the other side of that supply chain. Oscar Danilo Blandon, Ross's supplier, the Contra-connected cocaine trafficker, became a paid DEA informant. He testified against Ross in court. He received a reduced sentence. He was released. He was given a green card, and he was placed on the DEA payroll at roughly $43,000 a year. The supplier walked free. The distributor got life, and the intelligence agency that connected them was never charged with anything. Oliver North, the National Security Council staff member at the center of the Iran-Contra affair, was convicted of 3 felonies, and all 3 convictions were reversed on appeal. He went on to become a best-selling author, a Fox News commentator, and the president of the National Rifle Association. He is currently a free man who makes paid speaking appearances. John Poindexter, the National Security Advisor who approved the operations, was convicted on 5 counts. All 5 were reversed. He later served in the George W. Bush administration. The men who facilitated a covert operation that funneled cocaine into American cities received no lasting criminal consequences. The man at the end of the supply chain, the illiterate kid from South Central who could hit a tennis ball but couldn't read an application, received life in prison. That's not a miscarriage of justice. That's justice functioning exactly as designed, protecting the architects, punishing the symptoms. And the journalist who told you the truth, Gary Webb, the man who spent years connecting the dots, who published Dark Alliance, who tried to show the American public what its own government had done, he was methodically destroyed. The LA Times, the Washington Post, and the New York Times ran coordinated rebuttals of his work. His editors retreated. The San Jose Mercury News distanced itself from its own reporting. Webb was demoted, reassigned, and eventually pushed out. His career was over. His marriage ended. His reputation, which he'd spent decades building, was dismantled in months. On December 10th, 2004, Gary Webb was found dead in his home. The cause of death was 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Ruled a suicide. 2 gunshot wounds to the head. Ruled a suicide. I'll leave you to draw your own conclusions. Now, in 2017, the FX television series Snowfall premiered. It tells the story of Franklin Saint, a young man in South Central LA who builds a crack cocaine empire in the 1980s. The character is loosely inspired by Rick Ross. The show is well made, beautifully acted. It captures the devastation of the crack epidemic with genuine emotional weight. But here's the key difference between Franklin Saint and the real Rick Ross. Franklin Saint is an avid reader. He's intellectually curious. He makes calculated decisions based on information he's gathered and processed. The real Rick Ross was illiterate. That changes the moral frame entirely. Franklin Saint chose the drug trade with open eyes and a capable mind. Ricky Ross fell into it because every other door was locked, and the one person who should have given him the key, the school system of the United States of America, never bothered. Snowfall is excellent television. But like every Hollywood version of a drug lord's story, it gives the audience a protagonist who is just sophisticated enough to make the audience feel comfortable. A literate strategic criminal is a character. An illiterate kid failed by his own country is an indictment. Ross was eventually released from prison in 2009 after his life sentence was reduced on appeal. He was 49 years old. And here's the detail that I want you to remember, because it contains something close to redemption, or at least defiance. The man who couldn't read when he entered the drug trade taught himself to read in prison. And now he writes books. He is an author, a criminal justice reform advocate, a speaker. He learned, inside a cage, what the American school system refused to teach him when he was free. And then there's the final indignity. The rapper Rick Ross, whose real name is William Leonard Roberts II, took Ricky Ross's name, took his story, took the mythology of Freeway Rick, and built a multi-million-dollar music career on it. Gold chains and Maybachs, and songs about moving weight, all wrapped in the borrowed legend of a man who lived it for real and paid for it with decades of his life. The real Ross sued. He lost, because in America, even your name gets taken from you and repackaged for entertainment. Your suffering becomes someone else's brand. This is where all the threads converge. Every theme we've traced across 8 stories. Government complicity, from the Lehder-Noriega connection, through Escobar's CIA entanglements, through Barry Seal's betrayal, through the Contra pipeline that fed Ross's operation. The mythology machine, turning real human destruction into television and film. The informant's paradox, where the government's most valuable assets are always the most expendable. The exit that doesn't exist, where the only way out of the drug trade is prison or death. The double standard of justice, where the architects walk free and the foot soldiers serve life. The American appetite, the insatiable demand that built every empire we've discussed and destroyed every community those empires touched. 8 stories, 8 drug lords, 8 government partners. Not one exception. Not one story where the criminal operated in isolation, opposed by a clean and functioning system. In every single case, the system was in the room, signing the papers, looking the other way, collecting its share. The pattern isn't hidden. It never was. It was just inconvenient. And inconvenient truths in America don't get investigated. They get adapted into prestige television. So, here's what we know. Carlos Lehder built the transportation network, and a foreign government gave him an island. Barry Seal flew the planes, and the CIA put cameras on his aircraft while the White House leaked his name. Pablo Escobar built the cartel, and a dozen governments negotiated with him as though he were a head of state. Griselda Blanco turned Miami into a war zone, and American banks laundered the proceeds without consequence. The Cali cartel replaced the Medellin cartel with corporate efficiency, and their intelligence network rivaled the DEA's. El Chapo tunneled across the border, and corruption on both sides of it made the tunnels possible. And Rick Ross distributed crack cocaine across 42 American cities, with products supplied through a pipeline the CIA knew about and protected. Every drug lord had a government partner. Every criminal empire had an institutional enabler. Every supply chain had a handshake in it between someone who wore a badge and someone who didn't. Hollywood shows you the criminal, the mugshot, the mansion, the machine guns, the dramatic arrest. It gives you the version of the story where one extraordinary individual breaks the rules and pays the price. The truth implicates the system, and the system doesn't make for comfortable viewing. There's no mugshot, no dramatic arrest, no moment where the protagonist looks into the camera and you feel the satisfying weight of justice arriving. Because the system doesn't get arrested, it gets promoted. It gets a pension. It gets a library named after it. The war on drugs has cost over $1 trillion since 1971. It has not reduced drug use. It has not reduced drug supply. It has filled American prisons to capacity and beyond. It has destabilized half a dozen Latin American nations. It has created a permanent underclass of convicted felons who cannot vote, cannot find housing, and cannot find employment. But it has, admittedly, made for excellent television. The next time you watch Narcos, or Blow, or American Made, or Snowfall, or Griselda, or any of the dozens of films and series built from these stories, remember that you're watching the version someone decided was safe to tell. The version where the criminal is the protagonist and the system is the backdrop. The version where one person's choices explain everything and institutional complicity explains nothing. The story is always about both sides, but only one side ever gets the movie. Sleep on that. Since you made it this far, I'm glad you enjoyed the episode. If you would like to continue listening to episodes with similar themes, I linked them in the description below. You will also find a playlist of our most popular videos. Sleep now, Midnight Magnates, and wake up, as always, a little stronger and a little wiser. The story is done, but yours continues.